righty. Okay. Good afternoon. And I'm Bob Rubin. I welcome you on behalf of my colleagues at the Hamilton Project as we engage in today's forum, preparing for the next recession, policies to pursue relating to the impact on the U.S. economy. As we all know, our economy has been growing for roughly 9 years and is, roughly speaking, at full employment and full capacity. If you look at reported numbers, they suggest that the current rates of growth are somewhat above, actually quite a bit above, projected long-term potential. Preparing for the next recession as a consequence, at least I think, although there's no way of predicting when that recession may occur, is highly timely and hugely important. We're fortunate to have outstanding discussions to address this topic, including key decision makers in the 2008 response to the Great Recession. In keeping with Hamilton Project practices, the moderators will introduce the participants, both in the fireside chat and then the panels. But as you look at the resumes, you can see we were fortunate in getting a truly extraordinary group. Today's topic, in my view, is one piece of the broad and hugely consequential question of what we should be doing with respect to the nation's fiscal policy. In that respect, what I'm going to do is pose a few contextual fiscal questions that I at least think are germane to the focus on automatic stabilizers. Prior to the Great Recession, our debt-to-GDP ratio was in the neighborhood of 35%. It's now projected to be roughly, well, not projected, estimated approximately 78%. And according to the CBO, if you use their current policy numbers, it rises to 103% in 10 years. During the Great Recession, as we all know, very substantial stimulus was used, rightly. But once the recession was over and we got back onto a solid track and now have reached roughly speaking, full employment, full capacity, we are continuing to run large deficits, estimated to be close to 5% this year, and thus ratcheting up our debt-to-GDP ratio rather than trying to reduce it in a time of plenty. It seems to me that a threshold question is whether our fiscal condition should be part of this discussion of automatic stabilizers and should be part of the decisions on automatic stabilizers, or that discussion and those decisions should be focused solely and exclusively on the automatic stabilizers. Second is the question of whether our rising debt-to-GDP ratio in good times is likely to have a meaningful negative impact on the effectiveness of stimulus when recessions start. And then we think the answer to that question is yes, or might be yes, should that affect our decisions on automatic stabilizers? A related question to that one is how much we think our debt-to-GDP ratio can rise in good times without materially affecting the impact of stimulus and additional deficits during recession. Fourth, will the focus on preparing for recession dampen what little bit remains of concern in our political system with respect to our fiscal conditions? And should proposals on automatic stabilizers have any provisions or measures or statements of intent with respect to how we will react once we get back to full capacity and full employment? And finally, and again relatedly, when recession occurs and we respond with stimulus, should there be some legislative measures, or at the very least, some statement of intent, or that's obviously not binding, with respect to how we will react when we get back to full capacity and whether or not we will allow deficits to continue to ratchet up and debt-to-GDP ratio continue to ratchet up, or we will try to ameliorate or I guess redress would be a better word, redress the deterioration in the debt-to-GDP ratio, which would rightly occur during the period that stimulus is provided. One final comment. Our deteriorating debt-to-GDP ratio during good times can adversely affect the impact of stimulus by affecting confidence in markets or confidence in the business community, and that can happen because of a number of concerns: future supply and demand for capital, future inflation, or concern about future policy. Let me conclude by recognizing the Hamilton Project's outstanding leadership: Jay Shambo, our outstanding director; Kristen McIntosh, our highly effective managing director; and Ryan Nunn, our deeply thoughtful policy director. In a moment, Sam Fleming, U.S. economics editor and deputy Washington bureau chief of the Financial Times, will moderate a conversation between Ben Bernanke, former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board and presently distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institute, and Christy Romer, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama and current Wilson Professor of Economics at Berkeley. But before I turn the program over to Sam, I'd like to take a moment to remember my highly respected colleague in the Clinton administration, Alice Rivlin, who, as we all know, passed away on Tuesday. Alice was a public servant of the highest order, and she was a founding member of the Advisory Council of the Hamilton Project and made great intellectual contribution to its life through our life. I think Alice would greatly appreciate the discussion today. She was a fierce advocate of sound economic policy, once calling herself, and I quote, a fanatical, card-carrying middle-of-the-roader. Well, those of you who know Alice, that's what she was. But I think she had a very special meaning to that. I think what she really meant was that she was fiercely committed to intellectual integrity about policy and seriousness of purpose about policy. And it seems to me that we can all seek to emulate in our lives what Alice lived in her life. Thank you very much. Sam?
Well, thanks very much indeed. It's a huge honor to be here. I'm Sam Fleming from the FT. We have a phenomenal panel of people to discuss these issues. As we've just heard, this really is an extremely important time to be having this conversation. We are now on the cusp of what could be the longest recovery or expansion in US history, and yet we will, as we all know, eventually hit a recession, and when we do, the tools that we need to fight that recession are arguably in a feeble state. We have, for example, the Fed funds rate, effective Fed funds rate at about 2.4%. The past 3 recessions, you've needed a reduction of at least 5 points to stimulate the economy by the Federal Reserve. At the same time, fiscal policy is arguably maxed out. You're heading for trillion-dollar deficits. Public debt is heading, depending on the scenarios, towards over the next decades, unprecedented levels as a share of GDP. And so arguably, at the same time, you have deadlock when it comes to fiscal policy, a reliance on continuing resolutions and government shutdowns, so arguably a political backdrop which is not conducive, shall we say, to big stimulus programs and agreement across party bounds when it comes to fighting future recessions. As I said, we're extremely lucky. We have that rather grim scenario, and then 2 of the world's greatest experts in fighting recessions who are actually in the throes right in the middle of the previous one. Chair Bernanke was head of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014. He was right at the heart of the financial crash and its outcome and the response to try and propel stronger growth afterwards. He's now at Brookings and is an advisor to PIMCO and Citadel. Christina Roma is a professor at University of California, Berkeley, was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors right in the middle of the crisis at the beginning of the Obama administration, and was at the heart of the formulation of policies to try and fight the Great Recession. I'm going to start with Ben Bernanke. Chair Bernanke, the Fed obviously launched what was an unprecedented stimulus campaign right in the heart of the recession. Yet about 5 years after that, the Lehman crash, you still had unemployment rate of above 6%. It was a very slow recovery by any stretch of the imagination. If you look back at what the policies that the Fed put in place at that time, what worked and what didn't work? Why was it such a slow and sluggish recovery?
Well, I think the more accurate description is kind of half empty, half full glass here. So it was a slow recovery. On the other hand, it's been going on now for 10 years. It should be the longest recovery in U.S. history. Also, the pace at which the unemployment rate came down, while slow, was fairly comparable to other recession recoveries in modern U.S. history. So it was not radically different. On the other hand, as you point out, it was not as fast as we would have liked, certainly, and it involved a great deal of suffering, particularly among the people who were out of work for more than 6 weeks, for very long periods of time, which affected their own ability to come back and earn good wages. So as I said, it was kind of a half empty, half full kind of recovery. The Federal Reserve, we started off with about 500 basis points of room to cut rates. This was before even the financial panic. But by the time after Lehman Brothers' failure and the tremendous decline in the economy in the last quarter of 2008, beginning of 2009, at that point we were out of conventional ammunition. Short-term Fed funds rate was essentially zero, and so we had to look to other tools. And again, my assessment is half empty, half full. I think that those tools were effective. They could be effective in the future, but they were not perfect substitutes for the ability to keep cutting short-term rates in the conventional way. So what were those tools? Just very briefly, there were two major types of tools that the Fed used once we hit zero. The first was the infamous quantitative easing, which basically just involves the Fed buying Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities in the open market, paying for them by creating reserves in the banking system. Doing that had two beneficial effects. One was that beyond the fact that it also helped calm markets, which in 2008 and 2009 were in great stress, but beyond that, buying longer-term securities helped push down longer-term interest rates. A lot of evidence that worked. And it also signaled to the markets that the Fed was intending to keep rates low for a long time. We saw the reverse of that in the so-called taper tantrum when the Fed started slowing the purchases of assets, and that was interpreted by markets as saying that rates were going to go up. So the quantitative easing did work to lower rates and to persuade markets that policy was going to remain easy. The other main tool was open mouth operations or communication. The Fed engaged in what we now call forward guidance, basically telling the markets that they should expect rates to stay low for a long time. That evolved over time. In the beginning, we simply were using qualitative language. We said that we expected rates to be very low for an extended period, was the language, not very specific how long that was. But as time passed and we needed more stimulus, we became much more explicit. We began to talk about 2 years or mid-2014 or mid-2015. Then we began to give conditions under which rates would come up. And those techniques did bring down expectations of future short rates, which brought down longer-term rates and was effective, I think, in stimulating the economy. So my overall view, again, recovery was not as fast as we would have liked, but it was faster than you would have thought based simply on the fact that the Fed no longer had conventional ammunition as of the beginning of 2009. I think also two other comments. One is that one of the reasons that we were not even more aggressive during the recovery was there was a lot of concern both inside the Fed and particularly among politicians and others that these unconventional tools would have tremendous adverse side effects. We didn't think they would, but we had to be careful, and our assessment today, I think with the experience in hand, is that most of those effects were greatly exaggerated. So that, in fact, these tools could be used in the future, perhaps even more aggressively if necessary. The other thing I would just say is that we did learn a lot from the experience in terms of how to make these policies effective, how to coordinate them. So overall, I think it's a counsel of despair to say that, well, we have 2.4 percentage points of room to cut rates, therefore we can't do enough. We can do more than that. But on the other hand, if we have a very serious recession, I think we would be looking for fiscal policy or other policies to try to supplement the monetary response.
Okay, and we can get into that. Christina Roma, you were obviously at the heart of the fiscal response during the interregnum and also when the administration took office. When you look back at the fiscal policies that were enacted at that time, what are the key lessons you take from those, and what lessons should policymakers be taking today?
So I think I'll echo something Ben said, which I did think we learned a lot. And if there's anything even approaching a silver lining to this horrible experience, is that we do know a lot more now that maybe will help us do better the next time we face such a catastrophe. So as I'd say, there are probably four things that I'd highlight. So the first, and the simplest, but in some ways the most important, is that fiscal stimulus works. So, we had a fair amount of evidence before the crisis, and then the crisis countries did very different things. US states had very different amounts of fiscal stimulus, and economists have just used that evidence to try to figure out exactly what fiscal stimulus does. And, they're good, rigorous, well-identified, peer-reviewed studies. And what's really striking is, so fiscal policy works. The other thing, the effects are substantial, and when people say what's sort of that fiscal multiplier, when the government spends $1, how much economic activity does it stimulate? The estimates are all kind of in the 1 to 2 range. We have a joke among our graduate students: any study finds 1.6, but that tells you that $1 of government spending or other kinds of fiscal stimulus generates $1.60 of economic activity, and that's really important. So, as Ben said, we do have a tool that we can use, I think, the next time around. I think a second thing we learned is not all fiscal stimulus works as well as it could. So for example, I think one of the things that was a little bit a shot in the dark in the Recovery Act was the state fiscal relief. Just simply, it hadn't been done all that often. There wasn't the empirical research to tell us what it would do, and it turned out to be one of the most effective pieces. So I think that's an important lesson. On the other hand, on the tax cut, we thought we were following good economic practice. We said, let's kind of convince people it's likely to be permanent. Let's just have it kind of slip into their withholding rather than a one-time rebate. And it turns out, again, the really good research says, most people didn't know they got one. And so that certainly would change my view of how we would do things going forward. I think a third lesson, and one I learned painfully on my own, is that your fiscal policy response is only as good as your data about where you are, your forecast of where you're going, and how functional your political system is. And that those three things all conspired, I think, in early 2009 to result in a fiscal stimulus that was too small. And I think one of the things that says is the focus of this conference, where rather than having to guess where the economy is going and having to get it passed through Congress, to the degree you could automate this, make it fast, make the economy be the determinant of how much you get, I think is really important. And I guess my last point is going to come to pick up on what Bob Rubin said, which is, I think one of the things, and this is coming from some research that I've been doing with my colleague David Bromer, is that how much fiscal stimulus a country does in response to a crisis depends on where they start. That we found in the crisis that countries that started with a low debt to GDP ratio did a lot more than countries that started with a high debt ratio. And whether that's because they were genuinely or rationally concerned about the market response, or that's the way policymakers think, it's a fact of life. And I think if anything, it's made me more of a deficit hawk in good times than I used to be, because I think I'm less worried perhaps than Bob about that fiscal stimulus won't work when you have a high debt to GDP ratio. I'm just really worried that countries won't do it if they start with a high debt to GDP ratio. So I think where that leads me is in thinking about fiscal policy for the next recession, you can't you also have to think about fiscal policy today, because I think getting our debt and deficit under control in good times is probably the single most important thing we can do to make sure we have this really vital tool in bad times.
I mean, you mentioned the political constraints. Those were partly self-imposed by the Obama administration. There was a concern that the markets would revolt if the stimulus was too large. There could be an adverse reaction. You, I believe, argued quite forcefully for a larger stimulus and was actually enacted it. How could that have changed the trajectory of the crisis if it had been a much larger stimulus, and also one which had been curtailed less early?
So I think, I mean, as I said, the evidence is so strong that fiscal stimulus does stimulate, and I think certainly the United States was not in a position where markets were not about to lose confidence in us. So if we had done more, I think it absolutely would have been much more effective. I think we would have gotten back to full employment faster. We would have done less damage to the labor force. All of those things. I think something I've heard Ben talk about is in many ways the worst part of this was sort of what happened in 2012, 2013, of when the economy was still so far from recovered. To move then to austerity was just really a shame, terrible policy, not what we should be doing. And I just find it the most cruel irony that we have a giant tax cut in 2017 when the economy did not need it, and we were desperately in need of it in 2011, 2012, and the political dysfunction really prevented it.
Ben Bernanke, you, quite early on after the passage of the ARRA, were raising concerns about the deficit, saying we need to think about fiscal policy going forward and getting back towards a balanced position. Were you too early in making that argument? And what do you think the curtailing of the fiscal stimulus, not only in the US but globally, was a significant factor in the slow recovery that we did see?
Well, the Fed chairman's role in fiscal policy is a very subtle and complex one. So I testified before Congress 80 times, so you probably can find almost any statement somewhere in that transcript. And obviously there were various pieties you had to ascribe to, such as the fact that in the very long run, of course, the budget must be responsible. And also, of course, there was the constraint that the Fed, does not control fiscal policy, and therefore tried to be as balanced as possible, but not take the side of specific. When you go to Congress, congressmen are always saying, "Well, won't you advocate my particular plan to provide a subsidy to watermelons or whatever it might be?" And of course, you have to be as cautious as possible. But I think overall, maybe I'm just selective memory, but overall, I was concerned about premature tightening. And I think I invented the term fiscal cliff. I was often commenting about the risks associated with allowing the tax cuts to expire and to the sequestration in 2012, 2013, and so on. So again, caution because of my role, but I did believe at the time that, first of all, that the 2009 stimulus was very important, and that it was, if anything, too small. That was the view of some economists at the Fed at the time, and I certainly had those discussions. I was appreciative of the additional fiscal, even though there was no new package after 2009 of the same size and drama as the ARRA. There were additional steps taken, extensions, and so on, which was useful. And I was concerned, very much so, about the general tightening. So in 2010, there was a meeting of the G20 in Canada where a number of finance ministers around the world were all talking about, particularly the Canadians, were all talking about, well, it's now time to begin this this tightening process. And Tim Geithner and I pushed back against that, and particularly against the Europeans, who were, of course, even more austere than the inclinations of the U.S. Congress. So, within the constraints of what the Fed chairman can say, I think I was generally in favor of continued fiscal support, recognizing, of course, that the Fed's ability to handle all this by itself was limited, and fiscal policy was an important tool for the U.S. economy.
Well, guys, I think
Sure.
one of the things I remember Ben saying, which I think was exactly right, is right, at a time like 2011, 2012, when people were getting all this talk about the budget deficit and the debt to GDP ratio, the right policy is let's continue with the short run, stimulus, whatever, but keep your eye on the long run, right?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
that is absolutely, that is a very sensible strategy, not to move immediately to contraction when the unemployment rate is still 9%, but rather to put in place a plan for how you're going to get back to sensible policy in good times.
Now, the benefit, obviously, of automatic stabilizers is a lot of the political constraints become less relevant because these things kick in automatically, and your concern about where you are in the business cycle is less of a constraint. So there's the benefit. The problem with the idea of automatic stabilizers, obviously, we know budget policy in the United States is hopelessly deadlocked. Let me ask you both about your views on how you might go about, in the current context in Washington, making an argument for larger automatic stabilizers in the US, an argument which might begin to create sort of broader support and begin to change the way, change this deficiency, arguable deficiency in the way fiscal policy works in the United States.
So I think you're raising a really important point, which is, I think many of us are saying, boy, the political situation is such, no matter how bad things get, do you really think Congress would pass another fiscal stimulus? I worry that same thinking is going to feed into getting any Congress to say, let's do a big automatic stabilizer. I was wondering if one could, might be a way to balance it, right? So to either, to tie moving to more aggressive automatic stabilizers to a long-term budget plan, or doing some difficult things that would, in some sense, be good for the budget. So I think that's probably, if I were to guess, what's a way you might find political consensus is to do something like that. So I guess this is going to, I've mentioned how good the state fiscal relief was, right? So as an emergency measure, if you wanted to do something like that in an automatic role, you could combine that with rules about what states have to do on their rainy day funds and things in good times, right? So to kind of be balancing that way, maybe you could get some political consensus that way.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get people marching in the streets demanding automatic stabilizers. But what you can do, I think what you hope to do maybe would be to use it as an additional argument in some cases. So for example, there's lots of interesting discussion about the earned income tax credit. How can we make that more effective? Clearly, and I was also CEA chair, but under President Bush, and we looked a lot at unemployment insurance and how that could be made, a better tool. So I think in the context of reviewing some of these various programs and tax programs and the like, the need for automatic stabilizers can be an additional argument and say, well, this has the additional benefit that it kicks in, in bad times and could be helpful. That's just one political reaction. The other thought was, and Christy introduced the idea of state and local governments. A big problem for the total fiscal impulse in the early stages of the recovery was that even as the federal government was providing stimulus, the states and localities, as their incomes, their taxes fell, and most of them facing balanced budget requirements, were cutting back quite severely, and that was very negative. I would imagine that governors and mayors who hold a lot of the political power in America, would be very interested in proposals that would allow them more flexibility to balance budgets over a number of years, or to have some kind of fund that the federal government would contribute to. If you put it in the context of improving budgeting at the state and local level, that may be one vehicle for thinking about this.
You mentioned political opposition on the monetary policy side that you were encountering during that period. Let's cast things forward. The Fed, if we were to see a significant slowdown, would almost certainly have to think about unconventional. Maybe it's now conventional monetary policy once again. Do you foresee similar political constraints on the Fed next time, and does that give you concern when it comes to the Fed's ability to respond to the next downturn?
Well, you have to think about it. I'm not terribly concerned. I'm not certain that this would be a big problem. First of all, the Fed's use of forward guidance, I think, is relatively uncontroversial, and the Fed probably could do a good bit of that without any kind of political reaction. The difficult thing politically was quantitative easing. There were a lot of concerns about, again, possible side effects, which so far don't seem to be at all evident. So that substantive argument, such as it was, doesn't seem to be there. It seems like a good reason, one of the reasons for opposition was simply Republican opposition to measures that were, supporting the recovery at that stage. Now we have the president, asking for quantitative easing. It's not, the politics is getting very confused. I think that the Fed would not be eager to jump right into quantitative easing because of the political complexity and because it involves operational issues as well. But I do believe that given the experience we had, given that not only the United States but other countries have used this tool successfully, given that the side effects that were predicted have not appeared, I think that in a significant downturn, I think the Fed would be able to and would be willing to undertake more asset purchases.
Christina Roma, we have now an expansion which has been going on for the best part of a decade, and yet the Fed has not been able to sustainably generate at target inflation, let alone above target inflation. How much does that worry you when we think about the monetary policy side of this dual response to a recession, about the Fed's ability to muster a sort of muscular response to the next recession?
So I think the fact that we, and not just the Fed, but a lot of countries around the world have had trouble getting back to their inflation target is just, I think it all kind of feeds into how much room is any monetary authority going to have to cut interest rates, because obviously if the inflation rate is hovering around 1 or 1.5, that means the nominal interest rate's going to be lower. So I think that does worry me. I do lose sleep at night. I think we are going to enter the next recession with way less fiscal space and despite the evidence, way less consensus on fiscal policy. I think I might be a little even less sanguine than Ben on unconventional monetary policy, because I think I'd certainly agree that, say, QE1, right, when the financial system was a mess, I think that was incredibly helpful, right? And we do see those big effects on long-term interest rates. I think the subsequent rounds had less obvious positive effects. So I'm a little more worried that we're not going to have all that much, but maybe we haven't quite figured this thing out on the monetary side. So both of those make me really nervous about where we're going to go the next time. In fact, if I were going to add a third, something that really struck me from the time we were there is the degree of international cooperation. So that October, coordinated rate cut across many central banks, or the April 2009 G20, where countries pledged to, sort of all do fiscal stimulus. Again, I feel the current, relationship between us and other advanced economies is such, I worry we wouldn't see some of those same things. So I think all of those make me very nervous going forward.
Chair Bernanke, let me ask you to respond to that point that Christina Roma has just made. We have an administration right now which does not appear to believe strongly in international cooperation. I think that's an understatement. Does that make it more difficult if we do have a crisis for the US to be at the heart of the kind of worldwide response that we saw from 2009 onwards? Does that give you worry as well?
It does make it more difficult. There was a lot of coordination on a number of dimensions, including not just fiscal policy, but also regulatory policy and dealing with the multinational banks and all those complexities. I think central bankers are kind of a special group in that they're not politicians and they tend to work together quite a bit. So I think that, at least at this point, I think the relationships among global central bankers are still pretty good, and that cooperation and coordination to some extent would still be possible. But I take Christie's point absolutely that one difference, don't overdraw this, but one big difference between 2000s and the 1920s, right? When the 1920s, when all this ended up in being a global depression, one of the differences was that the major powers in the 1920s were essentially at war with each other. In the early 2000s, we had a great deal of cooperation, great deal of goodwill. So that is an important element, particularly in a global situation like we faced a decade ago.
I'm getting some great questions, by the way. So if you do have questions, please do fill out your note cards. Before I get on to these questions, one further question on monetary policy. The Fed is currently doing a major review of its framework. You've obviously, Chair Bernanke, made some comments on what you think the Fed should think about in future, the idea of a temporary price level target. It's fair to say that Jay Powell, the current chairman, has said that there should be a very high bar to changes. It seems unlikely that we'll see a change soon. Do you think this is an urgent problem, both of you, that the Fed should try and rework its inflation targeting framework in order to prepare for the next downturn?
Well, I'm glad that they are thinking about it. It's certainly a good time to be reviewing that. And I do think there are probably improvements and clarifications that can be made. I don't think it's necessary to abandon inflation targeting in any radical way. But I think there are useful things that can be done in terms of defining what it means to hit the target, being clear about what circumstances, if any, you might want to overshoot the target to compensate for an undershoot, things of that sort. And I think those are the kinds of things they're likely thinking about in the hope that creating a stronger commitment to reaching the inflation target after a period at zero interest rates will create more confidence in the market that, in fact, the Fed will do what's necessary. So I think there's some interesting directions to go there, but I take Jay and Rich Clarett at their word when they say that they expect evolution, not revolution, that it's possible to modify the existing framework in ways that would make it somewhat more effective in a zero lower bound situation.
I guess I would go further than that. I think especially, one of the things I find frustrating is many central banks around the world conduct these periodic reviews, and it really does feel like they all say, yep, we're doing it just right. And it does feel like it surely can't be the case that 2% is the magic inflation rate and just every country has discovered this. So I think there is room for more than tweaking around the edges, or at least really actually seriously thinking about revising the framework more aggressively, because I do think we're going to hit the zero lower bound a lot more going forward. I am more worried about whether quantitative easing is really going to work. I'm worried that we won't do fiscal policy. So I think we need to be really thinking, is there a way to make monetary policy a lot more effective?
Let me start asking you some of the questions we've got from the audience. One combines the themes of monetary and fiscal, which is how do we ensure that the benefits of automatic fiscal stimulus won't be wiped out by a countervailing move by monetary policy? How do we ensure better coordination effectively between fiscal and monetary authorities? Christina Roma.
I think one of the striking things is that I don't feel that coordination is all that hard. If you think back to 2008 and 2009, it's like everybody was together fighting this crisis, and I find it very hard to imagine that if your automatic stabilizer is being triggered by a downturn, why would the Fed be counteracting it? So I'd be very surprised.
That's especially the case if interest rates are at zero and,
Yeah.
and there's no room, for further cuts. There's certainly no reason to offset the effects of fiscal policy, whether automatic or discretionary.
But let's think about the coordination issue. I mean, you've in the past talked about the need for fiscal, in extreme circumstances, fiscal and monetary coordination, the potential for helicopter money. Do you think that there's a greater chance in future recessions that that kind of response will be needed?
No, I think that, on mature reflection, I think that the biggest thrust in that situation has to come from the fiscal side. The monetary policy can maybe encourage the fiscal authorities in some ways, but that in practice that you need to have aggressive fiscal response when you get to the point where both conventional and unconventional monetary tools have reached their limits.
Just one other thing I'd add. So, one of the things we've learned about the importance of, of independent central banks is absolutely an independent central bank is better for inflation control, all of those things. That doesn't mean that the fiscal and monetary authorities never talk, right? It's that you don't criticize one another in public, but there is plenty of back and forth sharing information, and so I think that is, I think the idea that we're all rowing in the same direction is a much more likely scenario.
On public debt, we have a question. Is there a level at which debt to GDP could, if high enough, could in this country provoke some sort of market reaction? The bond vigilantes, as this questioner asked, dead or dormant?
I will say that there very strongly that there is certainly no magic level of debt. There's not the so-called 90%, whatever. I think there's just really not evidence for that, and especially I think it varies greatly across countries. And if there's one thing we learned, the strangest thing in 2008 is when there's a financial crisis that's originating here. What do people want to do? They want to buy U.S. government bonds, right? That bizarre, the flight to safety, we're still the safest place. So I think there's, that said, surely there's some level of fiscal irresponsibility that the U.S. could take that would cause a problem. And so, I think that's part of what I was trying to say is that you can't be in the situation of let's just all have a party and pretend like it doesn't matter. It will matter at some point.
I agree with that, but we just add that debt-GDP ratio is not necessarily a great measure when you have interest rates that are so low now that debt service relative to government spending is actually not as high as the debt-GDP ratio would suggest.
I mean, I haven't had a question on modern monetary theory yet, but so I'll ask it anyway. Do you see any? Do either of you see any merit in the argument that actually the real constraint should be inflation, and apart from that, a country which has a monopoly, has a currency like the United States and can print it at will, doesn't need to worry about public debt?
I'm looking at Ben.
Oh, that's not fair. I'll just say one thing. I mean, there's a lot of issues, but one thing is that in a crude version, and I'm not blaming the originators necessarily, but a crude version is that the government can of MMT is the government can spend whatever it wants, as much as it wants. It doesn't matter. Even in the context of MMT, that's wrong, right? Because the MMT theory says that beyond a certain point, the demand is overwhelming supply, and you'll get inflation, which means that beyond a certain point, you have to pay for what you're spending. So even in the MMT context, it doesn't imply unlimited ability to spend. It just means it's a different set of criteria. I think there is some validity to the idea that inflation is a major consideration for monitoring fiscal policy at a given point in time. But I think you still have to worry about the accumulated debt because you have to think about future situations where interest rates might change, for example, or the economy might be growing more slowly, in which case the given amount of debt would have more effect on the economy than it does today.
And I just want to come back to sort of one of my original points, which is one of the ways that it matters is exactly what we're all worried about, which is what happens the next time we face a major crisis. And if the debt to GDP ratio really is 120%, I think the chances that we would take the kind of aggressive fiscal action that we would all want, I think is going to be much less likely. So that I think that, there's lots of good stuff that people want to do on the fiscal side today. My plea is just please pay for it. I think that's important.
This is a political question, but one questioner wants to know, do we only have hope for fiscal policy solutions under a united government? How do you think about the political complexion that we face, and how significant a constraint is it, the need for united government when it comes to the next recession?
I don't think that's empirically true. I mean, there have been, there was a tax cut. The Bush administration also did a tax cut early, in the crisis, before we knew how deep the recession was going to be. So both parties, both divided and unified governments, have been able to do fiscal policy. I think it's a question of persuading people that the situation is severe enough that some action is needed. Of course, there'd be disagreements about the exact composition of the program and so on, but there were some votes, at least, for the ARRA from the Republican side, right? I don't remember exactly.
I think 3 in the Senate. Yeah.
2.5. So so I'm a little more scared. I think that yes, in the past, I think if you go back to one of the, certainly a place where I was naive in 2009 is in thinking that you pass a fiscal stimulus, you make your best guess of what's the right size, and of course if it turns out that the recession is much worse, you'll do more. And one of the things we learned is that consensus, what we had thought was everybody wants to help an economy when it's tanking, disappeared. And so I'm not sure that it will come back.
What is the balance, this questioner wants to know, between the discretion and automation when it comes to fiscal stimulus? What is lost when we move towards more automated fiscal stimulus that you gain by having a more discretionary program to fight a recession, Christina Roman?
So I would guess I was trying to think about this last night, because certainly a number of countries had more, stronger automatic stabilizers in 2009, and they certainly, that certainly helped them. I find it hard to imagine that anybody would have strong enough automatic stabilizers that you're not also in a really extreme situation like 2008, 2009. You're going to need discretion. And so I think just realizing that we can make our automatic stabilizers better, stronger, faster, but I don't think it's going to get us ever, away from having to do discretionary in an extreme situation.
And just observe that discretionary policy can perhaps match up the mix of programs according to whatever's, for example, if housing is a particular problem, then maybe the programs can be slanted in that direction. So there's some flexibility in discretionary policy that's not necessarily built into the automatic programs.
When you think about part of the issue in this country is obviously the limited ability of states to stimulate via deficits. What kind of reforms at a state level would you, based on your experience last time around, what kind of reforms at a state level would you be pushing in order to allow greater discretion, at least in the state level, and not everything from having to come from the federal?
So, one of the things I think Ben mentioned, which is, states, I think it is appropriate that states have balanced budget requirements, but you could make them a little more flexible. So rather than having to do it in a short period of time, over some, more extended period of time. It does feel like if we could, the rainy day funds, which is how states are supposed to handle this, would be a really good way to improve policy, right? So if in good times states put more money aside so they had a lot more to spend in bad times, I think that would be a huge improvement. I've been trying to think, and I'm sure we'll discuss later, about how you could do the federal to state fiscal relief as an automatic stabilizer. I think one of the things you're going to have to think about there is we don't want this to become, let's just make our states, the federal government takes all the downside risk. I think you do have to tie that to they also need to be more proactive in good times.
No, I think the federal government, if it can be found ways that the the federal government could front states and localities to give them some flexibility in, in the short run. That would be one way to do it. But I agree with Christy that it's important that states and localities maintain a long-term balance, but they need more flexibility than they have, I think.
A couple of questions on monetary policy again. One is the issue of negative interest rates haven't been tried, obviously, in this country, has been tried in Japan and the euro area. Do you think, even if there is legal capacity by the central bank in this country to do negative interest rates, there's any political likelihood or even desirability for it to ever be achieved?
Well, I think this whole issue is blown up by rhetoric. It's actually not a very big issue in terms of monetary policy because the scope for cutting rates negative is not that big. And because those actions would likely be temporary, their effects on longer term rates are quite modest. I think the Fed looked at this in 2010 when I was still chair, and politics, I think, is obviously a negative, but beyond that, we were worried at the time about the effects on financial institutions. So for example, at the time, we were still remembering the money market funds and the crisis in 2008 when there had been a run on the funds. And money market funds promised to pay dollar for dollar their depositors back. And we were worried at the time that negative interest rates might make that hard and we might generate a new run in the money market funds. The Europeans, some of them are worried about their banking system and how negative rates might affect their banking system. So I think the overall sense, and I'm certainly open to persuasion on this, the overall sense is that negative interest rates, where they've been used, have been a modest help, but they've also had some downsides in terms of their effects on financial institutions. I don't see much appetite in the Federal Reserve for doing this. I think they will focus on other things as well, but I think the novelty of negative interest rates has caused it to be a much bigger, debating point than it actually is, I think, a fairly minor component of an overall portfolio of tools that a central bank might have.
I think Ben is exactly right, and it's at most a small extra tool, but I don't think it's ever going to be a big part of unconventional monetary policy.
We're nearly out of time. What we've focused entirely on monetary and fiscal policy. There is one area we haven't touched on, which was absolutely central to the large crisis, which was the financial sector interventions. And your research recently, Chair Bernanke, suggested that financial heart attack effectively in Wall Street was fundamental to what went wrong for the US economy. Since then, there have been reforms which arguably restrain or reduce some of the discretion the central bank has to intervene when it comes to financial sector issues. When you look towards the next crisis, it may not come from the financial sector, it may well come from the financial sector, the shadow banking sector or other areas. How concerned are you about the reforms, if at all, that have happened since the crisis and the constrained discretion?
Yeah, I actually have. I've been more sanguine than Christy on a lot of these issues. On this one, I think that no one get behind me on this one. I've written some pieces with Tim Geithner and Hank Paulson about this. I mean, our general sense is that the risk of a crisis from ex-ante perspective is lower because banks are stronger, more capital, more liquidity. The system is better regulated now than it was in many ways. But if a crisis were to happen, that the firefighting tools, if you like, that were used in the last crisis, many of them have been cut back or eliminated. I'll give you a long list, and although there's still some questions about whether that could be made still better. And the other question is the designation authority, the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Janet Yellen and I and Jack Lew and Tim Geithner just wrote a letter, explaining our concerns about whether the FSOC has essentially given up the ability to designate firms that are systemically risky for additional oversight by the Fed, and whether that might also create additional risks going forward. So I think broadly speaking, our system's a lot stronger, we're better prepared, but if a crisis does happen, I think we have we've taken away some of the tools that were important in responding last time.
I'll agree again here. I won't say I'm as concerned as Ben, but I'm very concerned. I think the one The one thing I would add, so maybe it comes from, we've had all of these anniversaries of the financial crisis and sort of that kind of discussion. And one of the things that comes up is that, absolutely the emergency measures that were taken were critically important. The stress tests were critically important. I think oftentimes people don't give the fiscal response enough credit for how it helps the financial system. So Tim Geithner and I used to have this back and forth. He'd say, there's more fiscal stimulus and financial rescue than in what you're doing. And I'd say, well, there's more financial rescue in the Recovery Act than what you're doing, right? And I think the idea is if you can get the economy growing, that is great for confidence, that's great for the financial system. So that if we would use this tool, I think it is actually something that does also help you when you're not going to have some of these firefighting tools.
We're going to have a very brief break and then return immediately with our next panel. So do please stay around. And before that, please join me in thanking our superb panelists.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. We're going to get started again. People could take their seats.
Not sure what I'm going to do with the book, but
Flash it. I read it all. Airplane back.
just in case.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome once again to this event. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm Jay Shem. I'm the director of the Hamilton Project, and I'm going to moderate this panel for us. I want to first just echo a couple thanks that Bob Rubin made earlier. First to Kristen McIntosh, our managing director, without whom none of these things ever happen. Melanie Galarski, our events coordinator, without whom we wouldn't all be in the right seats, I'm sure. And Ryan Nunn, our policy director, who co-edited this book, which hopefully you all picked up, and I'm very happy with that we've just put out today. I also, though, want to very much thank our partners at Equitable Growth. We did this project jointly. In many ways, this project came out of a conversation that Heather and I had about a year and a half ago, where we said, boy, everybody seems to agree that we need more automatic stabilizers, but there's a real question of how would you do that? And what would you do if you had more automatic stabilizers? And so we put together a panel of people to try to write specifically how would you add automatic stabilizers to different parts of fiscal policy of the United States. And those are the 6 proposals that sit in this book. There are 3 points that we make in the introduction that I think broadly help us ground all the panels, really. The first is that recessions hurt. They're not fun. They do great damage to individuals, to firms, to government balance sheets, and we should do things to mitigate the damage in recessions. The second, as Christy Romer laid out quite forcefully there, is that fiscal policy can help. And I think we knew that already, but we know it even more now than we did 10 years ago, and that we know that especially when we're in a recession and when interest rates are at 0, fiscal policy can be an effective tool to mitigate the damage in a recession. And then lastly, we make the argument that we probably need a new mix of policy than we've had in the past, that we can't count exclusively on monetary policy, that we may hit the 0 lower bound a lot more. The last 7 recessions, I think it is, the Fed has cut interest rates 5 points. I feel pretty confident it won't cut them 5 points in the next recession, starting at around 2.4 today. And as Ben Bernanke said, there are other tools, but those other tools aren't perfect substitutes. And so we may need better fiscal policy, and we may not want to rely exclusively on discretionary policy coming out of our political system, but instead building something in automatically. So this panel is going to focus on a particular way we could do that. And in particular, something talked about a bit in the last panel, how do we do this better via the states? How do we help the states make sure they don't cut too dramatically? We have a framing paper to the book that lays out that first case. The second paper in the book is by Louise Shiner, who's at the Hutchins Center at Brookings, and it's a great paper I recommend to you, looking at the cyclicality of government spending and taxes in the United States. And one of the things that comes out is that it is countercyclical broadly, both because we have some automatic stabilizers and we do typically do discretionary policy. State and local spending is mildly pro-cyclical. They tend to spend more in good times and less in bad times. And that's not something you want. That's something that in particular in the 2008 crisis worked badly. And the cuts in the states really made the recession harder to climb out of. And so we have 2 proposals here that we could try to mitigate this. And so let me introduce our panel. We have Jason Furman, who is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, spent 8 years on the economic team in the Obama administration, finishing the last 3 or so years as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Andy Howitt, to his left, senior vice president at the New York Federal Reserve. I should note for Andy, in case he forgets, that as he works for the Federal Reserve, you shouldn't attribute any of his views to the Federal Reserve or to the New York Federal Reserve or to the Federal Reserve System, but just to Andy.
Very well done.
I've heard it many times. Jean Lambro is the commissioner of the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, has been a professor at a number of schools, and was the director of the Office of Health Reform and then deputy assistant for health policy in the Obama administration. And Shoshana Liu is the executive director of the Colorado Department of Transportation, was also in the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, and spent
time as both the CFO and Assistant Secretary for Budget at the Department of Transportation at the federal level. And so I feel very fortunate that we have these panelists, in particular our discussants, who have experienced both at the state level and the federal level, to think a lot about how a federal-state partnership could work to try to mitigate these effects in a recession. So with that, let me jump in and start with Jason. Could you just tell us a bit about how you would like to fix this issue and kind of your proposal as to how you see we could make the problem states encounter a little less problematic in a recession?
Yeah, so the proposal is with Matt Fiedler from Brookings and Willie Powell, who's at the Kennedy School. It represents the views of Harvard University and Brookings. And I just want to say why I was so excited to do this before getting into any of the specifics. And it's really to exercise my own demons by putting something up on a shelf that I really wish we had had in 2008 when we were putting together the Recovery Act. I think we did about as large and good a job as we could have, given the political constraints, given the time constraints, given the information available. You could debate either side of that proposition. That's certainly what I think. But what we didn't do is do anything to, in any lasting manner, improve our counter-cyclical capabilities. There were pieces of the Recovery Act that became permanent, like the EITC and child tax credit, but there's nothing in the Recovery Act that will help us in the future for the next recession. It would be great to deal with this issue while the sun is shining and improve the automatic stabilizers, but at the very least, if we don't get around to it while the sun is shining, in the next recession, when we're putting things in, we should be asking ourselves, is there a way to do this not just to help this recession, but to help the next recession after? And also to ask ourselves, if we're not quite sure how big this recession is going to be or how long it's going to last, to make sure it works really well for the full duration and magnitude of this recession, not just our current guess, with the hope that we can come back and adjust it. Because as Christy said, the political system had this bizarre reaction that if everything is worse than you thought it was, that meant it must be that the medicine was the problem, and so you should take less medicine, not that that's a great argument for even more. So my motivation was, I think you need specific ideas on the shelf, because when you're in the crunch of everything, it's really hard to come up with them, and we need to have them now. I'll do very briefly the specific idea that we put forward. In the last two recessions, we, policymakers, expanded the match rate for Medicaid. So right now for Medicaid, the federal government pays 60% of the cost. For CHIP, 70% of the cost. Those match rates went up. What this proposal would do is in any state when the unemployment rate is elevated, it would automatically raise the match rate in proportion to that elevation. It's calibrated to offset about 2/3 of the state fiscal fluctuations due to that excessive unemployment. It would have delivered a match rate that was 20 percentage points higher on average during the last recession. So instead of 60, it would have gone to 80 for regular Medicaid. If you compare it to what policymakers did, it would have started sooner in the 2001 recession. It would have lasted longer in the 2007 through 9 recession, and it would have been a lot larger in the 2007 through 9 recession, growing to as much as 0.6% of GDP, which is about 1/3 of the average discretionary fiscal stimulus we did over that 4-year period. So it's quite substantial. Certainly, I wouldn't just do this. There's 5 other proposals in the book, but it's something that is designed to trigger automatically. And the last thing I'd say is this precedent for doing this on a temporary basis. This is just saying let's make the triggers permanent. And there's also precedent for having triggers, just having a formula like this, in that the current match rate is already a function of average state incomes relative to the national income. That formula means it's not cyclical. This just adds basically another thing into the formula which makes it cyclical. So the mechanism is there. We just need to change the way the mechanism is done. And by itself, it could offset a substantial fraction of the state level fluctuation and make sure that money attaches, especially to a program that's critical for low-income households and for their health.
Great, thanks. Andy, I'd like to turn to you. So you come at this from on a different angle instead of on the health spending angle, on the transportation side. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your proposal, some of the challenges you see for it, and how you think it might help.
So I think the interesting thing about infrastructure is that it has a couple different effects. It's got an important short-run effect that is sort of a stimulative effect, where the building of new infrastructure, public works, actually employs people and creates stimulus in the economy and real activity in the economy, and that's an important part of infrastructure. A second thing, and I think something that makes infrastructure different from other kinds of stimulus, is that infrastructure is a long-lived good that provides benefits well into the future, both maybe for firms and for households. And so that aspect makes infrastructure kind of a different animal when it comes to thinking about stimulating the economy. And that second aspect, the long-run aspect, might actually have effects on the stimulative benefit of infrastructure, because if firms and households expect the economy to be more productive in the future, that could lead them to more activity in the present. So there's a sort of maybe knock-on effect that comes out of infrastructure, as opposed to something that's more consumption-based. Now the challenges are many, I think, in imagining an automatic stabilizer that would exploit both of those kinds of benefits. So the first and maybe the most important is that to get good projects that are going to have a good payoff for firms and households long into the future, you have to think hard about that. You have to plan for that, and that's not something that you can necessarily do very, very quickly. But in an emergency situation, in a recession, a downturn, you'll want to move quickly. You'll want to have the money go out the door very quickly. So figuring out a way to get the benefits, the long-run benefits, while at the same time doing it quickly is, I think, the major challenge that an infrastructure automatic stabilizer, or even any infrastructure stimulus plan would face. In fact, Jay and I sat on a National Academy panel where we were looking at the infrastructure, the transportation part of the ARRA, and this was one of the things that was sort of thought about is, you know, the money went out the door fairly quickly, but it didn't necessarily go to the projects that had the very highest benefit cost ratios for the economy. So that's an important challenge to overcome. So the proposal is to use an existing program focused, as Jay mentioned, on transportation to get the benefits both short run and long run. The idea of using transportation is twofold, really. First of all, transportation is a very large part of infrastructure investment, so it's important and consequential for the economy as a whole. Number two, and maybe equally important, there exist mechanisms already in place for the states and feds to interact, and the states play a very important role, of course, in the spending of infrastructure dollars, particularly in transportation. Having an existing mechanism for getting dollars from the feds to the states is very helpful. You don't have to recreate that in the crisis. So the proposal is to use something called BUILD, which stands for Better Utilizing Investments to Leverage Development. It's a federal Department of Transportation program that collects proposals from the states and decides which of those proposals to fund in any normal given year. And the idea of the program is to develop not just 1 year's worth of projects, but a whole catalog of projects that would last several years, perhaps 5 years worth of projects. So the states would provide the federal government, under the BUILD program, projects that could be spent out over the next 5 years, that would be started over the next 5 years. And that catalog would be built and would be constantly refreshed. The federal government would pay for this development of the catalog so that the states would be able to keep their catalog up to date and refreshed. So there'd be this sort of list of projects that the states are hoping to undertake over the next 5 years. If a recession occurs and the SOM rule is implemented, where the unemployment rate rises enough, we will then, rather than just spend this year's obligation of money, bring forward future budget authorization to spend in the current year. So that'll allow, you could say, 5 years worth of money to come into the present, so that instead of 1 year's worth of authorization, we'd end up with 5 years in the first year, in the recession year. And then that money would be spent based on A, the speed with which the states could spend the money, and B, benefit cost ratios. So the idea is that we're looking for projects that will have substantial economic benefits in the long run and can be built quite quickly in the short run. So that's the way we can square the circle between this sort of short-run stimulus and long-run benefits. Ultimately, after the recession begins to ease, we can start to think about trimming future authorizations such that the aggregate amount of spending doesn't have to go up by any more than is desired. Rather, the timing of the spending is what really changes.
Great, thank you. So, Gene, I'd like to turn to you and just think a little bit about some of the challenges that states face, and you saw this from the federal perspective, obviously, that states face in a downturn, making it hard to kind of meet their health spending obligations that they have and can tempt them to make cuts when they maybe shouldn't, or we'd rather they didn't, and how you see a proposal like this helping.
Sure. I want to begin by saying that the state of Maine has a strong and healthy economy. There is no recession on the horizon. And we do, however, take fiscal responsibility seriously. Governor Mills, just this week, when we proposed what's called a change budget, we found that we had more revenue in our most recent revenue forecast. So she used that, among other things, for two actions. First, she added $20 million to the existing amounts in the Budget Stabilization Fund. Second, she added to a one-time reserve we created to ensure that the Medicaid expansion is affordable. We have allocated we have a fund that allows the expansion costs to be 20% more than projected without going back to the legislature to seek general funds, even though we are on track to be below our projections. Expanding Medicaid, though, was the first action the governor took when she took office. This is a reversal. The previous governor vetoed the expansion 7 times and then did not implement the ballot initiative that required the state to expand Medicaid. The rationale that he put up almost every time was fiscal responsibility. It's irresponsible to create this long-term drain on the economy by expanding Medicaid. And indeed, at one of my hearings, I got the question, why would you expand Medicaid when we could be on the brink of a recession? You're just expanding coverage to all these people. You have to cut them all off if there's a recession in Maine. And my answer has been that the expansion is the last thing you would want to cut in a recession. It is funded at 90% federal matching payments. So for every dollar you cut in state general funds for Medicaid, you lose $9 in federal funding. Equally important, in Maine, there are about 21,000 people who have been covered to date. 53% of them are men, and the largest age group is 19 to 29. That's the age group that are most likely to lose their jobs and lose their health insurance and will be in greatest needs. And it is interesting, while it should be the last thing a state does in a recession, which is cutting the expansion back, it's probably the first thing that states like North Carolina should do, because it would immediately bring in, again, $9 for every $1 that the state invests. But I bring this up because it illustrates why I would argue this needs to be federal rather than state. State legislators often disproportionately focus on that marginal state general revenue dollar, not necessarily looking at the federal dollars or the broader economic impact. There's 2-year budgets, not 10-year budgets. We don't even project whether or not there's going to be, different fluctuations in the economic cycle very far out because of the nature of our budgeting. And I would argue that in a world in which you're comparing short-term needs to long-term potentialities, there's going to be always a preference for the short-term needs versus something that may benefit the state in the long run. And I would like to talk just for a second about why Medicaid FMAP proposal versus others. And the book is, I think, quite interesting in looking at infrastructure, TANF, et cetera. And my arguments would be, we do know that, going back to the 1.6 economic multiplier, there is a good rich literature on how healthcare can actually be a good stimulant to local communities. Healthcare jobs are higher wage jobs than transportation jobs. We know that people care and value healthcare, so the odds of it being cut back in a recession are lower. I could also argue that while the Medicaid proposal may be better than some of the other proposals, it is also better than general revenue sharing, because one of the things that is clear in my state and other states is that we found our governor used a flexible funding source like TANF for other priorities that had nothing to do with either TANF or the state economic needs. So as we think through the choices here, there are some really strong arguments to be made for the Medicaid CHIP FMAP proposal compared to others.
Great, thank you. So Shoshana, you have this very unique perspective, having watched how the federal dollars going out affected states' behavior on the one hand, and now working in two different states, thinking about how the federal dollars coming in affect the state. And so I'm curious just how you think about the challenges state DOTs face when there is a shortfall in revenue coming out of user fees and things like that, and how a program like this might work or how it might help or not help.
So from the outset, I would echo a point that Andy made in the introduction, which is there is a sort of twofold role that transportation spending plays when dealing with a recession and the sort of stimulative effects. The first is that it is a mechanism which, if used right, can put sort of steady dollars out on the road, literally, and create jobs that are good jobs, stable jobs, and put people to work. Secondly, it does have this long-term sort of stake in the ground impact, which, at a time of economic downturn can be sort of inspirational to people and be really iconic for what it means for the government to do its job. You think about the imprints in places like Rhode Island, where you can still sort of see the way that the WPA symbols were embossed into the sidewalks. And from that to the signs that we put up during the Recovery Act, it is a very visible way for people to see what the government is doing. There's sometimes a little bit of tension between those two goals. From the kind of spending standpoint, the most efficient way to put transportation dollars to work as part of a stimulus package is through the Federal Aid Highway Program, which is geared towards very important things from the perspective where I sit, but mostly state of good repair, kind of routine road and bridge investments. And if you look at what happened during the Recovery Act, that is where most of the dollars went. Roughly $28 billion, of the total amount that was in ERA, what was put towards those programs, for things like bridge replacement and repair, resurfacing, and you actually saw a real impact. A study that we did at the end of the Obama administration, showed that the metric for measuring structural bridge deficiency, went down a couple % over the course of the years when ERA money was spending. It was twice as fast as had been in the years prior to ERA. In Colorado, where I currently work, roughly 3/4 of the ERA dollars that we had went towards those kinds of repairs. And, right now we have a relatively, low level of structural bridge deficiency. So, it did a good job getting those kinds of bread and butter investments on the road. At the same time, there is a desire to have these sort of transformative investments that make a long-term impact in what the economies look like. And, you see case studies where it worked great and where it did not. To just show a brief study in contrast, in Colorado, Denver Union Station, I think, is one of the iconic projects that sort of shows what a Recovery Act investment could do to, reinvigorate a downtown and transform an urban community. And, it was tremendously successful, and it really does have that impact that was hoped, and it was complete by 2014. By contrast, the California High-Speed Rail project, which was one that a lot of us put a lot of time and effort into during the Obama administration, has not yielded the sort of current impacts that I think we would have hoped. One kind of tangible difference between those two projects is what the state of readiness was at the time of ERA. Denver Union Station had all of its permits, it had a private partner lined up, and its timing relative to when the recession hit was sort of phenomenal. The California High-Speed Rail project still does not have all of its environmental clearances, and I think that speaks to the point that you raised in the paper about what it means to build that pipeline, from the time when it's good to the time when you need it. And I think that's a tremendously powerful recommendation and really echoes, the way that we view transportation at the state level. Coming in at the beginning of a new administration, where one of the first things that we're doing is taking a strategic look at what is in our pipeline. Talking to people across the state, not about how you pay for it, but about what you pay for and how to build, that kind of pipeline of investments that solve what the communities need, whether it is state of good repair or the sort of transformative investments. I think where there's a question to be had, and where I might take a slightly different path than is recommended in the paper, is whether something like the BUILD program, which is run kind of through a selection process that is guided federally to the states, is the fastest way to put money in the ground. It's not the fastest, and where you stand is where you sit. That program, from the federal level, has the way to inform specific projects and enact transformation. From the state perspective, it's a bit of an inefficiency. So it is faster to go through the programs that kind of met out money directly through a formula to states, and then the discretion is at the state level. I think there is a world where you could do a hybrid approach, where you kind of push that planning process and then put a little bit more of the discretion to states about how it is that you select the projects against those. But I think it's a very healthy conversation to have about the difference between how much you want the transformation versus how much you want to get the dollars on the ground, responsibly, but in the fastest and sort of most efficient way possible from a project perspective.
Great, thank you. I want to ask a few general follow-ups to the group and kind of go down the line just kind of quickly with how you see them. And so one question is just, why do any of this in this way, right? So if we think we need more automatic stabilizers or more fiscal stimulus, why can't the federal government just spend more money or do more tax cuts or give more money to individuals? Why is it useful to go through the states at all? Like, why should we bother with these formulas and these things? Why not just push more money out the door? And so maybe we just kind of run down the line this way. Andy,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a principle of fiscal federalism, and Shoshana just pointed to it, that the states are going to be aware of the highest value projects. They're going to know the communities. They're going to know where the dollars will do the most good. And so that's one, and they play an important role for that very reason. So,
states are going to cut back a lot in recessions, and we want to avoid those cutbacks for macro reasons. You could do the macro thing just as easily at the federal level or the state level, but also because we care about the services that those states are providing, and we care a lot about Medicaid. The second reason is that states don't have an incentive to effectively take into account the spillovers they have on other states and nationally in setting their fiscal policy. By giving them money, in part, you're helping just make it easy to spend more, but we're also changing the price of their spending, effectively reducing the price of their Medicaid spending, which would lead them to spend more or to cut back less in a recession. And so you won't have the situation that you have right now in Medicaid, that when a state cuts its Medicaid, it's not just hurting its own citizens, it's effectively cutting federal spending too, because it loses the federal match. And so it's creating an even bigger contraction when it does it through that program. So I think state fiscal relief is a good idea in general, and targeting it in a way that is a program we care about that also lowers the price of state spending effectively during that time is a particularly effective way to do it.
Jean?
I'll just add 2 points. We were talking recently about why Medicaid versus Medicare. One could imagine doing a Medicare countercyclical, but going back to the shared risk, you at least have states who are not going to be that interested in significantly increasing its provider payments or its activity in healthcare if it still bears some fraction of the costs versus providers who might, in a situation where it's a Medicare funnel for those resources, have some sort of behavioral effect. But the second is that it does actually have the twofold effect of protecting existing spending, but also freeing up some amount of state revenue. So it is a mix of mostly constrained how the resources would flow, but also frees up some revenue that states can use in their discretion.
In the infrastructure space, almost none of the kind of on-the-ground work happens at the federal level. It all happens either at the state level or, oftentimes even at the local or county or municipal level. And, when you think about how the jobs are created and where the sort of trickle down is from the money being appropriated to the point where it actually creates a job, it is usually in the transaction between the procurement that occurs between the state or even the locality, and the firm that will actually perform the work. So, from a practical perspective, you wouldn't be able to do it except at the state level.
Great. I realize, despite having written in my first note card in huge letters Q&A, I forgot to mention once again that if you have questions, we've got staff going around. Please they'll collect the note cards and pass those up to me for a few minutes from now. Second question then, if we think it makes sense to push some money to the states, why try to target it in these ways, right? Why tie the states' hands in any way? Why not just hand them cash effectively or write checks to the states? If we're worried about the budget constraints they're facing and that they're cutting back too much, why try to force them to spend either on transportation infrastructure or on healthcare? Why not just give them money? So is there a reason to do it with these constraints?
Well, there are a couple ways of thinking about that, I guess. I mean, one sort of standard economist way to think about that would be, well, it doesn't really matter whether you target or not. They're going to take it as cash and they'll spend it however they like. But it turns out that there's a little bit of evidence, quite a lot of evidence, that the money sticks where it hits, so to speak. So if we want to stimulate transportation spending, and I would say there might be reasons why we would, then giving the money as transportation money should help to accomplish that goal. One of the reasons why we might want to do that earmarking, if you will, is because transportation spending has a particular targeting that could be quite valuable. Construction is a very cyclical industry, likely to be lots of job loss in a recession. The wage profile is such that it's a group that most likely will have relatively high marginal propensities to consume. And we know from the academic literature that the multipliers, because of that, are quite high in construction and infrastructure spending. So that's a reason, I think, to target it in that way.
Yeah, I think partly there's a political argument. When we were putting together fiscal relief in 2008 for the stimulus, we originally had it as just unconditional state fiscal relief. And Rahm Emanuel told us there was no way we could just have Congress shovel money out to states to do whatever they wanted with, because who knew what they'd do. And he said, call it something attractive like teachers and nurses, and you'll get it done. So I don't think that's a trivial argument for a proposal. I think, though, as I was sort of explaining before, I think this is like state fiscal relief plus. It has all the benefits of state fiscal relief. If you want to use the money fungibly, you can, but it also protects some of the lowest income households, and it effectively changes the price of state spending, which gives a rational reason for it to stick there, not lead to the federal cutbacks and the like.
And I'm not sure it's an either or, right?
Yeah.
It may be a both, and I think that would be what I would recommend. I'm sure my governor would use that sort of resource as well. That said, I do think, imagine taking the challenge that happened in 2008, 2009 in Congress and multiply that by 50. You'd have to have 50 states come in, some have biennial sessions. It's a lot of work, and the question is, if you need this fast, and I want to go back to the timing, Jason and Matt's proposal has an automatic trigger which begins when it's needed, not when we see a problem, we bring in the legislature, we debate, we discuss, and then we may be not able to allocate the funds for months, if not years later.
Great.
I would agree with the observation that it doesn't have to be an either or. I think some measure of flexibility, whether it is within a certain discipline or sort of across a range of areas, you could call it water and transportation, both being infrastructure. It could be very beneficial to provide states flexibility to deal with the challenges that are different in Colorado versus Michigan versus California. At the same time, if you want the impacts of the measures to be sort of balanced across different communities, different constituencies, you have to put some constraints around it, because I think the way that different policy areas are pitted against each other becomes very tangible at the state level. I mean, something we see time and again in Colorado is that there are very overt attempts to pit education and transportation against one another in the budget cycle. Something Governor Polis is very, very intent on doing is to sort of move away from that debate and kind of force them not to be pitted against each other in that manner. But there is an instinct for it to happen, and in order for that not to happen in hard economic times, I think putting enough bounds on it to kind of measure that is helpful.
Great. I want to pick up on something, Andy, you said there, though, about the extent to which the spending does stick within the category we give it to states. And so, in some sense, to flip the question around of, does it matter if the federal government tells states what to do with the money when they're giving them money? Is money fungible enough at the state level that it is just going to wind up wherever the state wants? Or do we think proposals like these actually are targeted in ways that would lead to more spending in the places that the money is being directed?
Yeah, I guess I've already tipped my hand on this a little bit. I mean, I think if you give $1 to a state and say that you should spend this on transportation, what we've learned, I think, is that you can reasonably expect that transportation spending will go up, but probably not by the full dollar. So that's, in some sense, I agree with the notion that you wouldn't want to have to choose between directing and more general kinds of fiscal relief. And so, the states will take advantage of whatever flexibility they've got, and it's sometimes quite substantial to do that. So,
yeah. You can also make decisions in all of these on the flexibility. So we have in our proposal a maintenance of effort requirement, which we had in the Recovery Act as well. And so if you wanted to stick more, you can do that. If you want to just use this as a label for general fiscal relief, then you don't need to have a maintenance of effort.
I was going to say that.
Okay.
I would agree with the observation that it sticks, but probably not by the full dollar. And just having seen the budget process play out in 2 states, in both instances, the appropriated amounts that come in the legislative cycle each year for transportation are lower because the amounts meted out through the Highway Trust Fund are higher than in some other areas of policy. But you also still have more investment in transportation than in certain other areas because of that.
Okay, great. So I'm starting to get some questions, and I want to run through a few of these. So one of them points to a question of, what do we do if the states don't want the stimulus? Right, so we saw that, it's possible, right? There are some governments or some people who don't think, despite all the evidence that we see, that fiscal spending in a downturn is effective. There are some people who don't want to do it. And so how would that work? I'm curious, first, Andy and Jason, in your proposals, do you see that as a binding constraint? And for the 2 people who actually work in a state, is that a relevant concern? Or actually, you also probably both faced it at the federal level.
So I think that in general, states will have lots of transportation projects that they are interested in funding, and whether they can get them funded quickly because there's a special federal program that allows that, or whether they have to wait several years, I think they would probably prefer the former. Although I acknowledge that if it's called federal stimulus, it may undermine the case that would support that conclusion.
I think one of the beauties of, this is certainly true of our proposal, Matt and Willie, and I think it's true of many of the ones in this book, is that maybe the first time they were passed, there'd be a bunch of controversy and debate. But once they were there, they would just become part of the underlying landscape. So right now, 100% of states are in Medicaid. 100% of states are in CHIP. Those states have a matching formula. So your state, you're getting 56% of your costs paid by the federal government. Some other state is getting 63% paid. And I think each year, those matches reset based on your state income. So this would be exactly the same as what's happening now, but when your match rate went from 61 to 63, it would be because of another thing that was part of the formula that wasn't there right now. So as a legal matter, I'm not even sure if you were in Medicaid, you could just get money at the old match rate instead of the new match rate because you didn't like the formula. I don't even know how that would work.
Yeah.
So I think this would just be just an under-the-hood formulaic thing. Once it was in the law, I'm not saying that the initial debates would be that way.
Sure, although we still have 17 states that have not yet expanded Medicaid, and that includes, I'm looking at your charts, the unemployment rate in Maine still had not come below the 25th percentile of unemployment rate in 2014 when the Medicaid expansion took effect, and the state could have gotten the 90% FMAP, which would have helped in this economy, and it didn't. So I do think that there has to be kind of a reality or a realization that unless there's an idea that is totally ideologically neutral, not just financially beneficial, not all states may take it.
Most states have transportation projects and will take money for it. There actually was one example of a state that turned back in our grant in the rail space, and what happened in that instance from a pragmatic standpoint is that the money was redistributed. And I actually think that the ability to redistribute money if it is not used by a state is a good lever to incent fast spending too. There's actually a process built into the sort of typical spend down of the federal aid highway program, where if at the end of the year the ability to spend up and obligate has not been utilized, it does get redistributed to other states that will use it faster. And it is I can attest an incentive to spend your end of year funds.
I have one question that's specific to the transportation infrastructure space. I want to kind of push back, because I know both of you have talked about it a little bit, but it is just this question of, can we feasibly do something that makes things more shovel-ready, I think is effectively what the question is asking. Can we actually get to the point where infrastructure is spending on a timeline that is meaningful to fighting recessions or mitigating the effects of recessions? Either one of you can start.
Why don't you go first?
So I would start by saying that there actually are a lot of projects that already are ready to spend on the timeline of recessions. Your average run-of-the-mill, again, paving project, simple bridge repair project actually can be executed quite quickly, and with a planning process that pushed you to be ready a year or two in advance, much like I think you're suggesting, that is enough time to get those projects ready to go out the door. I think where it becomes more complicated is the more sort of visionary the project gets, the harder it is to execute, and there's an almost linear correlation between things that are interesting and things that take a little bit longer to deliver. I think that's why I actually believe that the recession spending can be a very good opportunity to take care of some of those basics that need to be done. They will always need to be done because the more you use our system, the more it decays, and it's a kind of constant asset management cycle where there's always a fairly large hopper of projects that are relatively simple that need repair. And from the perspective of a contractor who's doing a job, it does not matter whether they're repaving a road that's been repaved before or whether they're sort of building something that changes the outcomes for communities. From a policy perspective, it matters, but from a the vantage point of putting people to work in the moment, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think, I guess what I think of as the heart of the proposal is to build this catalog and to see, first at a small scale, frankly, whether or not that's a feasible thing for states to be able to do, to provide a catalog that's got the design ready, got the permitting ready, and is continually refreshed so that it's ready to go if and when there's a need for more, there's a need and an ability to put more spending out on the street. So I think that that's the key question, and as those who've read the chapter will know, it's a relatively small proposal. It's meant sort of as a pilot to see how it would happen, how it would work, and then if it's feasible, it could potentially be scaled up.
And just one small thing on the transportation side is there's a real incentive beyond the macro and a real benefit to doing it beyond the macro, just that materials are cheaper, labor is potentially cheaper, and if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis on an infrastructure project in normal times, jobs don't count as a plus because you're effectively taking those jobs away from somewhere else. In slack times, those are net new jobs, so they're a plus also. So this is just a really good time to do projects. The problem is, how do you get the money to do them? Well, if you know the money is coming, this is a great time to do projects. I think there would be a substantial incentive to have them ready.
Yeah.
I'm just saying a quick note about state government, which is, and I think we experienced this in ARA as well, which is this concept of shovel ready was not just applicable to transportation, it was everything we were thinking about. And creating something new, designing it, putting out a request for proposals, going through a procurement process, doing rulemaking, and hiring people adds considerable time to any of this activity. I'm discovering this trying to spend expiring funds for opioids that we're just trying to get out the door. So that's something we underestimate, I think, when we're designing federal policy.
And also, I should just add, since I think there's a question similar to this at the end of the chapter, kind of under their Q&As at the end of these proposals. Andy's also pointed out, you could think of in a really deep recession, a really long recession, it's not the worst thing if this is still spending out over a couple of years, just because we probably still want some activity, not kind of with a cliff.
And in the transportation space, that is what happens. An interesting point of data about how the ARA transportation money is spent down is that it spiked in 2009, but it didn't spike all the way up. It's basically there was measured spending roughly from 2009 through 2014. So we injected it once, but it measured itself out, and it did spend down on that longer time frame.
Great. There's another question which is less directed at our authors and more at our panelists who are sitting in states right now, which is, what is the most useful thing that you could imagine the federal government could do to help states if the economy turns around? So, these are two proposals of ways to help states. What would you really want if you got...
What are the third and fourth best ideas?
I was going to say, I think my job is healthcare, so I think I know what the answer is, but I don't know.
It may be against my own interest to say this. I think the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund that was part of the Recovery Act, was very much what states needed at the time, and that it injected relatively flexible, sizable tranches of money that were able to stave off cutting jobs as much as creating them.
Okay, great. Either one of you want to add anything? Or?
I have human services programs too that would welcome the funding. So, TANF, SNAP, there's some good proposals in this book about those proposals as well. Thank you.
I mean, I would add one thing, which is I think this portfolio approach that's been touched on a couple of times is kind of a nice aspect to think about. So maybe some general fiscal stabilization, some consumption-oriented, some investment-oriented programs, all combined, I think could make for a good general approach.
And I think that they don't all use the same formula is actually fine. A lot of federal programs already use different formulas. We worked hard to get our formula right. Others, Claudia did on hers. But with a bit of uncertainty around the instruments, around the formulas, some diversification in that respect, I think would be perfectly fine as well.
Jason, I want to come back to you with one quick question. Speaking of other formulas and other proposals, is there have been some other proposals about tweaking FMAP, and even in a counter-cyclical way. And I want to know if you just want to talk a little bit about why you like what the three of you came down with.
Yeah, I mean, there's the GAO has had them, others have had them. Our focus is on a state level proposal rather than a national level proposal, because the needs in states are different, because the cuts get worse and worse and worse as you do more and more of them, and so it triggers on in a bad time. The worse it is, the bigger you get, and it's designed to reflect the fact that you want to put the most money in preventing the biggest cuts.
And I just might add that one observation about the analysis is that there's a fair amount of quarters then that are in this elevated FMAP status, the way the formula is set up. And I'm just wondering if we should stop talking about recessions and countercyclical stabilizers and start just talking about reform. I mean, this is reforming the federal formula to pay for Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program in a way that recognizes that there's a greater need when there's greater unemployment, and move a little bit away from this framework, because I can say that the word recessions are something that nobody wants to plan for, nobody wants to work on right now, because it is something that you hope never happens. So I would argue that we should begin to think of this proposal, amongst others, as part of longer term, how do we preserve and protect and strengthen programs like Medicaid.
And I'd be fine with that. I mean, as I said, we already do it based on state income.
Correct.
We
Yes.
just do state income relative to the average national income.
Correct.
So if everyone's income falls 10%, it doesn't help anyone.
Correct.
This adds in effectively an absolute into that, in addition to that, the relative we already have there.
Correct.
Yeah, and in some sense, as you said, Jason, there are different types of triggers in these different proposals in the book, where yours is based more on the level of the unemployment rate, whereas Andy's and many of the others are trying to throw more money at the economy when it first starts to slow down, and in that case, it's more of a change in the unemployment rate. And that's, I think, probably the last question I'll have time to ask is maybe just to both of you. The question is asking a little bit more detail on how the size of the recession would affect what you're doing, or the length of the recession, or whether it would in any way. If you want to just quickly outline.
So the proposal is designed such that it'll have this sort of initial effect once the unemployment rate begins to rise in a significant way. If the unemployment rate remains high, the proposal will sort of continue to keep going, so that there would be more money brought forward to be spent in the near term rather than down the road, and that would be substituting for future spending.
Yeah. Our proposal is basically proportional to size, and it would last quite a long time unless the recession went over 15 years, at which point the trigger would reset and we'd need to pass a new law, and probably a lot of other things too.
Okay, great. I think that's about where we're supposed to stop this panel, and so I will first I will thank all of you and ask the audience to thank you. But before I do, go ahead. And we're going to take a very brief-ish break, about 8 to 10 minutes before the next roundtable begins. So if you need to step out for a moment, but please come back relatively quickly. Thank you.
Thanks.
I didn't really meet you, but
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Looking for someone to give us a cue. All right, if everyone could take their seats, that would be terrific. Thank you. I'm Karen Dinan. I am very pleased to have the honor of having a conversation with Claudia Sahm about her piece on providing direct stimulus payments to households in this really terrific volume on countercyclical fiscal policy. Just, kudos to the Hamilton Project and the Center for Equitable Growth. It is really a fantastic resource. Claudia is the chief of the Consumer and Community Development Research section at the Federal Reserve Board. I assume the same disclosure applies to you, that you're speaking for yourself and not necessarily the views of your colleagues. It's not in our official bios, but Claudia and I actually have something very important in common, which is that our first jobs as economists were being a point person on consumer spending at the Federal Reserve Board, which I would say is the best first job at the Fed. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay, good. And it is the best job because you get to, you're following consumers on a day-to-day, if not hour-to-hour basis. You are just immersed in the data and in the research as well. And so there's really just no better way to kind of understand kind of the forces that influence consumers than through this job. I felt like I came out of it just having a real appreciation of the importance of both kind of positive and negative developments for consumers, and just kind of how they changed their lives. And in turn, that just gave me such a sense of the human toll of a recession. I think as a macroeconomist, I'd been trained to say recessions are bad because we lose output. Output is low relative to potential GDP. But I think when you're working so closely, thinking about what's going on with actual people, you really gain the appreciation for this. And I think also, kind of relatedly, I just had this acute sense of just how bad it is when adverse things occur to people and businesses in this economy that might have been preventable. Okay, so that's really where this paper and all of these papers come in. So Claudia, let me start you with some questions.
Yep.
So if you could just start us out with kind of a broad-based or broad brush description of your proposal.
Okay, great. Thank you, Karen, for doing the conversation. I'm very excited about today. So I'll touch firstly on some personal context, since you mentioned this, like starting out working on consumer spending. And in fact, my very first year at the Fed was when the Great Recession started. So I very much learned, covering fiscal stimulus and understanding its effects on the economy, and then that turned into myself doing research on it. So I feel like this proposal and getting to work on it really was a chance to reflect on a lot of those experiences. And I totally agree that it was really heartbreaking to just see what was happening in the economy and to know that there are people behind that. So, but in terms of the proposal, so at just a high level, what I'm proposing is that we have direct payments to households that are made automatic. And in the case of a severe recession, those would be repeated annually until the recession subsides.
Great, terrific. So let's just get kind of more concrete, so we can get our minds around this. So we've used these sorts of payments in the past on kind of an ad hoc basis. So I think the last time we did this was in 2008. Is that right? Okay. So can you just to be concrete, like how would your proposal, how would it kind of play out if we had it in place then? How would it compare with what we actually did?
Right. Yeah, and so I want to be clear that the proposal is very much grounded in what we've learned in 2008 with the stimulus payments. There were also similar payments in 2001. And so I really am trying to build off of what seemed to work. And then there was other stimulus that happened during the Great Recession. And so when I think about what this proposal looks like relative to 2008, I mean, there is the point about this would be automatic, and so building up the administrative structures to do this kind of payment would be very different if you can look ahead. And I will say the staff at the Internal Revenue Service and Social Security did Herculean efforts to get those payments out as quickly as they did, and hopefully with some planning that could reduce the burden on them and give us some opportunity to think about more broadly which households or individuals could receive the payment. But if you just kind of line the two proposals up, which I do, or the proposal along with what happened in the Great Recession, which is in the chapter, the first year, so 2008, would have actually looked pretty similar. In my proposal, the way that these payments would trigger, it would have been like in April of 2008. In fact, the 2008 stimulus payments were authorized even earlier than that. But they went out in like May and June primarily, and I think if the administrative systems are in place, you'd see a similar timing with this proposal. And I also think that it's very important, having learned from the 2008 that this is a large stimulus, the payments are substantial, and so in a lot of ways.
So can you just be more explicit? What do you mean by large, and how
Right.
big were they in 2008? Is that roughly what you're getting at with your proposal?
It is roughly. I think one of the things that I stressed with the proposal is I think it should be, I mean, this is trying to stabilize the economy, so it really should be anchored off of the size of the economy. So in particular, the proposal was a percentage point of aggregate consumer spending, which is about 0.7 of GDP. So that's actually pretty similar to the magnitude in 2008. The 2001 payments were roughly half of that size.
And what are we talking about for like the typical recipient?
Yeah, so in terms of to households, you're something in like the 500 to 600 per individual. Obviously for a couple that would be more. And then there was a feature in 2008, which is also my proposal, that for dependent children, you'd kind of increase those payments. Mm-hmm. But really roughly, I mean, I think the academic literature, and we'll, I'm sure, talk a little bit more about that. I really think there were a lot of aspects of the 2008 stimulus payments that seemed to be very effective, both in terms of how much of it was spent. And I think really what the proposal is pushing is the idea that you need to get these payments out quickly, so early in the recession. So that, I think, looks pretty similar, the proposal and what actually happened in 2008. Where the proposal starts to differ from our experience with the Great Recession is really 2009 onward. And this was, Christy mentioned this before, but the idea of this proposal would be if the recession is severe, the unemployment rate has risen a lot, it's very high, that you would repeat those annual payments and then keep them at that large size until the unemployment rate starts to decline. And then you'd have this pre-commitment to continue those payments until the unemployment really has come down to a reasonable level. So that's where it looks different as you go out from 2009.
I mean, and I would, so having kind of been there kind of when we're worried about these things and discussing these proposals, I would say, I mean, it's great you save a month or two in terms of getting them out. I think on top of that, you're saving kind of policy energy, right? I mean, you don't have to have kind of the debate, you don't have to develop the proposal. That seems worth something as well. Okay, so the academic research. So I'd like to hear more about how you drew off the academic research. And I think the question that's on my mind and probably on the minds of people in this room is, okay, so you're going to send money out to households. The idea is to stimulate aggregate demand. We're going into a recession. How do we know households are going to spend it? I mean, how do we know they're not going to just kind of hunker down and save it? So tell us about that.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's on some level, it seems kind of obvious if you give more money to people, they're going to go spend it, especially at a time where they might, not have as many hours at work or lose a job. But I mean, there are very reasonable counter arguments, like you said, that in a time of recession, there's a lot of uncertainty. People might want to pull back on their spending and save, or at least put off purchases that don't have to happen right now. So it ends up being an empirical question, right? Because you could see it go either direction, and I think that's where the amount of research and the empirical studies, and really being like high quality, like a really good way to kind of study the effect, like how individuals reacted when they got those stimulus payments. And so I think that's one where the body of evidence is at a place where it really does look like households are spending substantial amounts in the range of like 50 to 90%. I mean, they're not spending all of it. So there are other stimulus that maybe would be a more one for one, but in terms of being able to get this out quickly, have it be sizable in magnitude. I mean, this really does look like it's a good way to support demand in the economy and to get it out early enough that it has a chance to help shorten the length of the recovery, make it not as deep of a recession, or shorten the length of the recession. And so I think there's just, it has enough of a stimulative effect, given other features of it that are positive, that it seems worthwhile.
And can we talk about, as long as we're talking about the marginal propensity to consume, can we talk about the kind of universal nature of the proposal? So I thought there was some interesting material in the paper as to, it's not, I guess, it's often thought that the marginal propensity to consume is quite high at the bottom, and that's certainly true, but it's actually surprisingly high for some groups throughout the income distribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think this is one where, and as Karen said, so in the proposal, the idea is that these payments would go out broadly in the economy. And there's very few restrictions on like who would receive a payment like this. And I think that's actually, that was a feature I thought was important for the proposal, but it is one where other economists, other people in this, who've worked in this area might disagree that the targeting would be beneficial if you put it, particularly focused on lower income households, had a phase out for higher income. So I mean, this is one where reasonable people can disagree on this, but I think there were a couple reasons why I thought this was important. One, I think when you look at the empirical evidence in terms of targeting, there is some differences of results about income, how important that is in terms of high propensity to spend. What is clear from the literature is, or more clear, is that like households with low liquidity, so not having a lot of easily accessible savings, liquid assets, they do tend to spend a lot more out of the stimulus, and they do it really fast, which again is what we're trying to do.
So you don't have to be so the point is you don't have to be low income necessarily.
It's much clearer if you have low, I mean, these two are often related and correlated. Yeah. So, and I think the thing is, administratively, it would be very difficult to target on liquid assets. And so to me, it's like if you really, if we could do that, which we can't, I think that would be a strong argument for targeting. And to your point, that's there are certainly households with high wealth when it's held in less accessible assets where they might have low liquidity and thus spend a lot. And so that's been shown in some research. So I think there's one piece that I don't think administratively we can target this the way we would want to. And then another principle that I felt was important in the proposal, and again, this is my opinion kind of looking at this, is I think the proposal I put out is very simple and transparent, right? And so that has some aspects both administratively, like it's easier to push it out, but I also think it makes the messaging of the stimulus like better and easier to explain. So
I just want to say this ties into something that Christy mentioned earlier, because I think this is very much related to your issue about it being a one-time, not one-time, it repeats, but it's kind of a larger lump sum versus gradual payment. And Christy was saying, there are tax cuts that people didn't even know, they didn't even see, they didn't notice. So, so I think that seems related too.
Yeah, no, and I think that's because so I had an opportunity to contribute to some of the research, the survey-based that was asking people, like, did you know about the change in withholding? And they're like, what are you talking about? And it was like a common mistake when people filed their taxes, they didn't claim it. So I mean, it's really clear that people didn't know it was happening. And to me, that really raised questions about like, what is stealth stimulus? Seems like it might not have all of the benefits. And I also, so I mean, there's that piece, and I think that's why like the one-time payments are really helpful, because in surveys, like people did know I got the 2008 stimulus payment. There were letters that went out. I mean, there was a lot of messaging, and so people knew that was happening. But I also think just being able to communicate to the general public, the federal government is trying, we're supporting you. Like this is a recession, and so there's, it's easier to say like there is money in your pocket. We are giving you. As opposed to some of the other, I mean, monetary policy is effective, but it is not necessarily easy to explain to individuals, to the general public. So these, I think, all of these policies that we talked about, they're complements, they work together. So I think this was one thing that I wanted to do in this proposal, is really have something that was simple, transparent, easy to communicate, and could
that people would notice. had
would
good
notice, yeah.
branding, you know, make people feel like they're doing their job for America by going out and spending it. Yeah, so I thought that was super interesting. You know, speaking of very interesting, I need to ask you about what now has been termed the SOM rule, which is the trigger for turning this on, which Andy referred to. I thought it was, that part of the paper was super interesting, and they didn't have a lot of time to talk about it in the last panel. But first of all, can you just explain the trigger? And then I want to ask you about kind of why it's so powerful, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, so the idea of the trigger, and I think this goes back to these types of stimulus payments have been used in the past, but in a discretionary manner. So like Congress, they had to decide like now is the time we're in a recession. So the idea of this trigger, if we're going to make these payments automatic, we have to know when to turn them on. And so what I propose is using a 3-month average of the unemployment rate and looking at how is the unemployment rate today relative to the lowest point in the last 12 months. And if that change, when it is at or exceeds a 0.5 percentage point, then that's a sign that now we trigger these payments. And so that's the idea of the trigger. And I have to say, I mean, this is one where when I was on detail at the Council of Economic Advisors, I remember Jason Furman talking about, like, this is, you know,
I learned it from Doug Elmendorf.
Yeah, so this is, so I also don't want to, like, I
wonder where he learned it.
Yeah, I'm like honored and embarrassed that this is getting called the SOM rule, but I mean, but the principle here is one that's kind of been widely understood. When the unemployment rate starts moving up in a substantial way, like that is not a good sign, right? So that was kind of where I started in terms of like looking at the changes.
Why the unemployment rate? I mean, why not GDP, consumer spending? Why do we like? So I love the unemployment rate. It's actually kind of one of my if I I'd like to say, if I were stuck on a desert island and could only bring one economic indicator with me, it would be the unemployment rate. But I don't want to steal your thunder. Why is it that you are also fixated on the unemployment rate?
Yeah, so I think first of all, like job losses go right to the heart of why a recession is painful and why we want to avoid them or make them as short as possible. So I think in just like that aspect of it, the unemployment rate is really important. There is the economist following, so this, like you said, the one you would take to the desert island. So it is a widely followed statistic. It's very timely. So you have a read on the unemployment rate at the beginning of the month on the prior month. So that's really useful, again, if you want to get these payments out soon. So it's widely followed, it's timely. And in that widely followed sense, it is broadly understood to be an important way that we think about the business cycle. People who are out of work, who want to work, I mean, that is a clear sign of we have unused resources in the economy. So I think there's a lot of good reasons why the unemployment rate would be one to base this trigger on. I think one of the reasons that it is better than some of the other macro indicators is that it's less erratic, right? So having forecast GDP, this is the last thing I would want to have a trigger based on, is it will move around from quarter to quarter because of inventories and all kinds of other stuff. And then also say financial market indicators, which are often used to kind of come up with predictions of a recession ahead of time. They're just, they're more false positive. Like things move around in ways that may not be as related to the recession or may not follow into a recession. So I think that's, those are kind of key considerations.
Yeah, and I will say, so it is true. I mean, I've heard many people kind of make this sort of comment that you're attributing to either Jason or Doug, but the first time I actually saw a graph that kind of illustrated the point was the one, I think it's figure 2 in your paper, I forget, it's like page 76 or something like that, but it is really remarkable to see something like that just doesn't seem to have false positives.
Well, and from like recession since the 1970s, it either triggers within 2 months or up to 4 months of a recession starting. So I mean, that's really early in a recession. And yes, there aren't the false positives. There's some false positives back in the 60s and where, I mean, but like really in more recent time, The one thing it is not good for, so it's really good at like, we're in a recession, we're early in a recession. It is not a good way to figure out how severe is this recession going to be. And so that was why in the proposal I had this like trying to set up the payments in subsequent years, because really like the start of the 2008 recession looks a lot like the start of other recessions that were much less severe. So that's one kind of limitation of it. It's not going to tell you everything.
Terrific. We have just a couple of minutes left. I guess a couple of questions. And one is, so I love the fact that this is kind of an evidence-based proposal. That's just so important that we're making policy in that way. But here's this thing we'd like to put in place, and presumably it won't be perfect the first time we do it. So is there a way to use your proposal so that we can kind of learn more about how to do this even better next time?
Right. Yeah, no, and that was a piece of I wanted to emphasize that point, because I think one of the reasons we can have as much confidence as we do about the efficacy of these stimulus payments is the fact that we were able to study them in 2001 and 2008. And there was just this administrative bottleneck of the government can only send out so many paper checks at once, and so there was a randomization of when people received the checks, and that was really what allowed us, unlike other recessions, to kind of separate out what are the stimulus payments doing versus what is the economy going south doing to household spending. And so the fact that it was having a very careful research design, and people were thinking about like making sure this fits in surveys and we get the information we need to do the study. And there are a lot of unanswered questions about exactly the way to tailor these. And so I think trying to build something in that will allow us to do future studies and really understand how this is working. I think it's important. I'm not sure, like the idea in particular came up, may not be the right way to go with it. But I do think, one of the goals of having a proposal and trying to like talk about all these different details is to really encourage a conversation about like how would we do that.
How do we do that? Yeah, no, and you're so right. I mean, these things are, I think I learned this from Gabe actually, like the wrong way to go about it, which is you just try to graph income and consumption and see if, like in the aggregate, and see if the tax rebates seem to be making a difference. And there's just so much going on in the economy while this is happening, that is the wrong way to go about it, and I think it is really important. Last question I had for you, and this gets back to the trigger issue, is I thought it was interesting that you offered two options. And one was having the proposal go into effect when you reach the trigger. Just turns on, we get those payments out. The other option was having a vote on the proposal being what happens when you reach the trigger. So you reach the trigger, but it's not like the payments go out without Congress actually voting to have this go forward. And I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of why the two options. I mean, there must be kind of pros and cons as you see them.
No, and I think this is really kudos to the Hamilton Project and the way they set up the process of putting these proposals together. I mean, I came to this very much as a researcher and like the evidence, but not and I understand that the politics, in addition to the economics, are important, but the politics are not my background. And so that was one of when presenting an early version of this proposal to people that are policy experts, this came up as an issue because they said if you make this fully automatic, these payments go out, then in a recession or the beginning of a recession, it's going to look like Congress is not being active. Like there is a part of wanting to really step up and fight the recession. And so, which it had not occurred to me at all. I was like, automatic stabilizers are awesome. Anyway, so like but this makes sense. And so so that was where this idea came from, is like you could make like the process, the structure of the payments, the trigger, like all of that could be automatic, which gives you a lot of time to think about the details, do the administrative aspects. But then that trigger would just mean, now it's going to come up for a vote, and kind of, some fast track type of, because all the groundwork has been laid, and yet it gives the opportunity to go in and all vote, and off it goes. So I think that was one that
maybe bring more attention to it,
and
too,
right? And bring attention to like we're making an active decision here. So that was one where it made a lot of sense to me, but I would not have come to on my own.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Claudia.
Thank you.
If you could join me in thanking Claudia. So we're going to just roll right into the next panel. Don't go anywhere. We're just going to get some more chairs up here. So.
Who do you have? So you want to be on the right. Sorry. Padilla? Padilla, how are you today?
Well, thanks.
So I'm going to just put this right here. You don't have any pockets, do you?
No, I do not.
So what I'm going to do is just give this to you, and you just hold it in your lap, I think.
Okay.
So the mic's on but muted. My cue is to unmute it when you step on stage. Nothing
Okay.
you have to do.
Nothing that I have to do.
Nothing that you have to do. Once you're on stage, though, whatever you say, you're sharing with everybody in the room, okay?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Did we lose Bob? We lost Bob. Well, that's a shame.
You're right. Nice to meet you.
And one more. There's 5 of us. Bob? Has anybody seen Bob? Oh, that guy, yeah. So welcome to the last panel of our afternoon conference here on getting ready for the next recession. My name is Heather Boucher, and I'm the Executive Director at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. It has just been really, it's been fantastic to be able to work on this project. Sometimes it's been a little bit, how are we going to make all this happen? So I won't say, I'm trying to be optimistic that we're going to get all these things passed and ready for the next recession.
This panel, we've talked over the day about the macro big picture, the need for fiscal policy, the fact that interest rates are still at historic lows. We're not going to have that 5% most likely by the next recession. So we're going to need to think about fiscal policy. We've talked about the role of the states and the role of aid to the states in various forms and spending at the local level as a form of fiscal policy. We've talked about direct payments that go to everybody. So we've talked about these general ways of getting money out there. And now we're going to turn to folks more at the bottom of the labor market, folks that were hit hardest by the recession, those who are unemployed, and really focus on the micro. One of the things that I have been most excited about for this project throughout has been the intersection between this call for fiscal policy and then really engaging folks that are thinking deeply about what that looks like. What do automatic stabilizers like? What would it actually look like to make those fixes? What could we put in people's minds that they could do now? But thinking about the role of the safety net and all of these programs where there's ongoing conversations about these policies, but not always in the context of their role as automatic stabilizers. And that seems like a really important thing to start elevating and to continue to elevate. So I'm very excited to be moderating this panel here. So I don't forget to say, there will still be little white cards handed out so you can ask questions. So you can, and if you didn't get your question in from the previous panel, feel free to just write it down and maybe I'll ask it, maybe I won't. Just giving you that option. So let me go through and introduce our panelists here. So first here, to my left, we've got Bob Greenstein, president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Next to him is Lourdes Padilla, who is the secretary from the Department of Human Services for the state of Maryland, and has a lovely pen here. Next to her, we have Diane Whitmore Schanzenbach, who wins the award for longest title. She is the Margaret Walker Alexander Professor of Human Development and Social Policy, the director of the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University, and a non-resident senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Yes, yes, you win. That's great. And then at the end, we have Gabe Chodorow-Reich, assistant professor of economics at Harvard University. They all have much longer bios, and of course, you all have access to those. So let me get right into it, and I'm going to start. We also have caveats on our panel. Let me just note for the record that everyone here is representing their own views, not any organization that they may represent. And just because you're sitting up here does not mean that you've completely endorsed the entire book. So, and that probably goes for everybody. Just so we have our disclaimers. So let me get right to the questions here. I want to start at the end over here with you, Gabe. So Gabe's chapter is on the unemployment insurance system, and can you sort of talk to, and that is sort of the classic. When you think about automatic stabilizers, that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. And here we're getting to it. It's been hours that we've been talking about this issue, and we're finally going to talk about the UI system. Tell us a little bit about the role of UI and what can be done to improve it from your work.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So there are definitely things that can be done. Let me start a little bit with the overview of the role of UI, and then I'll talk about some of our proposals. In the Great Recession, total payments in UI went from about $30 billion in 2007 to $130 billion in 2009. And that $100 billion increase is really why people think of UI as sort of quintessential automatic stabilizer. The first thing I want to point out is that of that $100 billion, about half came through the regular state program, meaning these are individuals who are unemployed for fewer than 26 weeks and claiming benefits under the regular program, which exists all the time. And so that increase, that part of the automatic stabilization, occurs without any extensions of weeks of benefits people can claim or really any other legislation. It reflects the fact that in a recession, there are more people who are unemployed, and some of those people are going to claim benefits. And then there's a program called Extended Benefits, or EB, which is meant to trigger on when unemployment in the state reaches a high threshold. So we've talked a lot about triggers now. It doesn't use the SOM rule, it uses other rules for a state. One of the issues is that historically EB has just played a really small role. And there's some reasons for that. One of them is that there are a series of trigger states can adopt for EB. Some of these are optional. And it turns out relatively few states have actually adopted these optional triggers. And a major reason why is that the EB program is financed 50% by the federal government and 50% by states. And that's deterred a number of states from opting into these triggers. So one of the proposals we have in the chapter is to make EB fully federally financed. And we think that'll improve that part of the program for UI. It also sort of dovetails with the discussion earlier today about ways to alleviate state budget finances during recessions. Now, if we get that, then EB in a state under current law would take people up to a total of 46 weeks of unemployment that they could claim. In every recession, in every recent recession, there's been emergency legislation, ad hoc legislation that's been passed on top of that to extend potential benefits further. So you might remember in the Great Recession, in some states, people could claim as many as total of 99 weeks of benefits. One issue is that those extensions tend to occur late or even in some cases after the recession has actually ended. So we have some proposals to add in additional automatic triggers and tiers of benefits that would take the potential number of weeks up to 73 weeks in a very high unemployment state. And we think this will help. But there's sort of an issue here too, which is relatively few individuals who are unemployed reach 73 or even 46 weeks of unemployment. And that kind of limits the capacity for these extensions to play a big role in the amount of transfers that go out. So we have some simulations in the chapter where we find that in a recession, sort of like the Great Recession, if we had these additional EB tiers in place, at their peak, it would have been about $30 billion per year. That's a lot of money from the perspective of people who are unfortunate enough to have long-term spells of unemployment. In conjunction, and this is where I think this book is really important, that it puts together a number of proposals with other things, it can help. By itself, that's about a tenth of what the Recovery Act was in 2009 and 2010. So just doing these extensions isn't quantitatively going to get you there. So we have another proposal to increase the weekly benefit amount for all unemployed individuals, including those who are short-term unemployed. This was also something that was done in the Recovery Act. In our proposal, we have this going up by $50 per week. So let me sort of bring that together and with three things. The first is we think these proposals would meaningfully help as automatic stabilizers, and very much in conjunction with other policies that have been proposed, they would help combat recessions. The second is UI is not a silver bullet, and it's sometimes thought to be in this context. And again, that sort of reflects two things. One is just the limited capacity of extensions to push out a lot of dollars because of the relatively few, fortunately, number of individuals who are long-term unemployed. And that's especially true early in recessions. So even in recessions where you get a substantial share of long-term unemployed, that happens later than you would like your automatic stabilizers to be kicking in. And then second is for increasing benefits to short-term unemployed, we review some fairly recent academic research and find that even for people underemployed, they actually save a non-trivial amount of that additional money. And so that also sort of limits the amount that is going to stimulate the economy. The third thing, and then final thing I want to say is, I think this is important to think about in the automatic stabilizer macroeconomic context. That's the theme of today and of the book. This is also really important for microeconomic reasons and the simple consumption insurance role that UI is supposed to play. And there's a lot of rationale that just on that account alone, it makes sense to extend benefits and increase benefit amounts during recessions. So we think it's important to think about these things in the context of stabilizers, but also not to lose sight of this sort of policy more generally.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabe. So, and just to kind of summarize to make sure that people really got this, right? So UI is really targeted, but on the other hand, it's not the only, some people do save some of that money, and so we also need to be looking broader is a really important message. The other thing that I think is really important in your chapter to pull out is that we both have the system that we know what to do with, and we need to shore that up. And these extended benefits are important, but we might be kind of losing sight of what's really crucial, which is just the regular UI system, which some states have been cutting back weeks for and making changes since the Great Recession, which is an important thing to bear in mind, that we have to be careful that we think about the automatic staples we have, not just moving forward. I want to move to Diane, who's going to talk about what I will always fondly think of as food stamps, but really now we call SNAP. So can you talk a little bit about SNAP and to the extent that you want other safety net programs? I mean, these are programs that are targeted at low-income families and, again, should be really the kinds of policies that target those who are most in need. Can you talk about the benefits of and how we think about this as an automatic stabilizer?
Absolutely. So to start, I want to explain a little bit about SNAP. It is already very well designed. Low-income families go to the office and receive benefits. If they have very low incomes, they get larger benefits, and then those phase out as their incomes get larger. Benefits are paid very quickly after you apply and are found to be eligible. And so this setup works extremely well during recessions, because as families lose their jobs or lose income, either they become newly eligible for SNAP, or if they're already on SNAP, they are eligible for more. So that pumps resources into the local area very quickly and just basically automatically. At our peak, about 1 out of every 8 Americans was on SNAP during the Great Recession. Then, as the economy recovers, we reduce the rolls in a way that I would term it the right way, that families earn enough that they no longer are eligible for the benefits, they no longer need the benefits. And so you can see in the proposal, we show it expands and contracts along with the economy already. It's particularly important to note that all of this money is spent, or pretty much almost all of the money is spent, because families on SNAP benefits have relatively low income. They have high marginal propensities to consume out of this. And it's quickly spent in the local economy. And so that brings us to an important multiplier effect in the macro economy. And we learned during the Great Recession, the additional money that they spent on SNAP had the highest multiplier effect of anything. But in addition, of course, as a microeconomist, I would not want us to forget that this is about people, and it reduces hardship. And it does more than just stimulate the economy. It helps people reduce hardship. And in fact, it particularly matters for children, although I want like all sorts of aged people to eat, but children I particularly care about. We have a study that shows that increasing access to SNAP benefits during childhood increases that child's long-term economic outcomes. They grow up to be more economically self-sufficient, they grow up to be healthier, they're more likely to graduate from high school. Increasingly, we're understanding that early childhood is a very important time to protect children from negative income shocks and from poverty. So the proposal about how to make this better for future recessions is to start by saying, it's already well designed, please don't make it worse. And so there are a couple of ways to do that, right? It's play a little defense here. Some people have been very interested in work requirements around SNAP, and those are, we can get into more details as necessary, or it's in that, but you're required to work a certain number of hours every month. The definition of work is very narrow. And in work that the Hamilton Project put out last fall, we were able to show that the majority of people who are sanctioned under work requirement sanctions are actually already workers. They're workers who work in areas where unemployment comes and goes, hours are unstable, et cetera. So we think that even in the best cases, work requirements in SNAP are not well designed. But some people want to expand them even more. So, we have a 3-tiered proposal. The first would be to eliminate it at all times, these work requirements. The second would be to make sure that we relieve them with some sort of a national trigger that's automatically applied. So when we hit the SOM rule, everything goes, we waive work requirements nationally, and certainly don't expand them. The other piece of the don't break this policy aspect would certainly be anything like a block grant would be just devastating to this program's ability to do the important job that it works. that it does. Next, we do want to make it better if we can, and this is piggybacked off of a very successful program that was part of the ARRA, which would be to, again, when the SOM rule triggers, to increase maximum SNAP benefits by 15% during economic downturns. Let inflation erode that away to the extent possible, and typically that'll be possible. So that'll just give that extra juice to the program in economic downturns. So two big things: don't break it, and then hopefully turn up the volume a little bit during economic downturns.
Well, thank you, Diane. And there's one chapter whose author is not being represented on the panels today, so let me just take half a minute to note that in that chapter, Indy writes about TANF, temporary assistance needy families, and spends a lot of time showing with a lot of visuals and data how, because TANF is a block grant, it's no longer working as an automatic stabilizer. So that point about not making food stamps block grant really is important if we want to preserve this automatic stabilizer component of the program. So I think that's a great thing to note. Lourdes, you work in a state. We've had a state panel, but now we have a different kind of state question. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, how are we thinking about these safety net programs and recession preparedness from a state perspective? Do you think that your state is ready? Are there steps that we can or should be taking to make sure that the safety net is ready for the next recession?
Thank you. Very good question. Let me start saying that recession is very hard on families, and it can temporarily lower the overall welfare of those families until they get on their feet. And one goal of a strong social safety net is to make sure that what we refer to the deep poverty, which is where the family goes when there's a recession, that we make that shallow and short. And how do we go about that is making sure that we identify resources available for the families so we can put those in place as the ones that have been discussed this afternoon, put them in place so we can help the families immediately. And also mitigate the impact of the recession. And in addition to that, we have to build resilience for future recessions, which is very important because we have seen, I believe that there have been approximately 47 recessions, and whether we go into one or not, I'm sure that would not be the only one. So we have to build resilience and identify how do we build that resilience. So a couple things come to my mind. One is states throughout the years, because we have been talking about recession for a number of years, and states throughout the years have been collecting a lot of data. And we have data on the families that we serve, where they live, the benefits that they are accessing right now, and the length of those benefits. So what do we do with that information? I don't believe that we really do a good job with that information. We have to leverage the information, and we have to pair that with the policies that we're going to be asking that are put in place to respond to the recession. So that's one recommendation that I have, that we leverage the data and put policies in place accordingly. So the other thing that I also wanted to speak is that we know that human services programs are always the bellwether of economic trouble. We know that. And we do a good job, and our goal should be to highlight those data that I referenced to across the various programs, not only the TANF and the SNAP benefits, but we have Medicaid, we have the Home Energy Assistance Program, that we should always align all of them so we can be responsive on time. And we do in the States a very thorough job on making sure that we're prepared for a recession. However, it's interesting that it takes a lot of efforts for us to get ready for a recession. And it takes even more efforts to be responsive to the policies that are carried out by the feds. But what we do and where we don't do a good job is that immediately after the economy recovers, they go away. They go away. So while I'm not saying that they should not go away, because I'm sure there's probably a reason, and one that can come to my mind is the cost. What I am thinking is that perhaps all the efforts that have been put in place, we could put a number of triggers dormant. One particular that comes to my mind is the system enhancements that we have to put in place when there's a recession, when we have to authorize the additional era benefits, when we have to increase the SNAP benefits. There was an enormous amount of money spent on system enhancements. And then when we have to redo it again, we have to spend the same amount of money in system enhancements again. So why don't we make those permanent but dormant, as I said, so next time we just have to pull the trigger and we can issue them. So that's somewhat of the ideas that come to my mind in terms of readiness. And the other one that I cannot forget is making sure that while we talk a lot about resources, the families that we serve have to know and be aware of the resources and have to be educated on the resources. And we have to do a better job on that. And that's something that I'm actively working in Maryland, making sure that we build a consumer portal. So when there's a recession, that they can easily log on and apply for all the benefits and get information also on how the nation and the state of Maryland is responding to a recession.
And I want to come back to that after we go through the round of questions, because I think that's really important. I also just want to raise up for all the researchers in the room, this sense that you're sort of saying we have all this data and we definitely need to be doing a lot more with it, leveraging it. At Equitable Growth, we actually have a grant program where we fund a lot of scholars using state-level administrative data, and so that's just very exciting. So we can keep talking about that. Bob, I want to turn to you to get your sort of reactions both to the book, as somebody who's worked on safety net issues for a little bit of time here in Washington. I'm curious to hear some of your reactions. But I also want to ask you, I think, this political question. Looking back at our experience in the Great Recession and thinking about this compendium of ideas in this book, what is your sense about whether or not we should be thinking about acting before the next recession happens? Or, kind of like Jason said in the earlier panel, this is the off-the-shelf, when the crisis happens, we can just pull it. I mean, it could be yes and, but I'm curious to hear your perspective on that question.
So I think a starting point is recognizing that the 2009 Recovery Act differed from prior Recovery Acts in the degree to which it had an array of provisions to temporarily strengthen safety net programs, looking at the higher marginal propensity to consume of low-income people, and also trying to alleviate hardship and poverty. And the impacts, I think, exceeded expectations, certainly on the poverty front. Many of us were struck when the 2009-2010 poverty data came out on how little poverty rose amidst the deepest recession in decades. Arlak Sherman of our center analyzed the 2010 poverty data and found that 6 safety net provisions of ARA resulted in close to 7 million fewer people being in poverty in 2010 than would have been in the absence of those ARA provisions. But what scares me is the 2009 Act, typically stimulus bills, UI tax cuts. No prior one had anything on a temporary SNAP increase. No prior one had subsidized jobs, which Indy's chapter talks about. 2009 was only the second one that had a temporary increase in the federal share of state Medicaid costs. And given the unfortunate narrative alluded to earlier, that since the unemployment rate kept rising after ARA was passed, a lot of people have in their heads that it failed. I think there's a significant risk, depending on who controls the House, the Senate, the White House, whenever the next recession hits, that we could have an old-style discretionary package that, other than UI and tax cuts, leaves out the other stuff. To me, this is one more reason why, if the political environment stars aligned and you had an opportunity before the next recession hit, 2021, whenever, if you had the opportunity to actually enact these kinds of automatic stabilizer recommendations and get them in the law before the recession hits, so you're not totally dependent on what the politicians who were there in the moment when the economy goes down will do, it would be really important to do. With respect to the book, let me just comment briefly on the UI chapter. So I thought the recommendations in the chapter were excellent. My comment is, I would argue we need to do some additional things to reduce the potential for state actions on UI to undercut some of the federal things Gabe's chapter talks about. In December 18, 23 states had UI trust fund balances below the Labor Department standard for what you need just to pay 1 year of benefits in an average recession. And when state UI trust funds are underfunded, they can take unfortunate actions. North Carolina in 23 cut benefits a third. I would couple Gabe's recommendation for a $50 a week bump with a maintenance of effort requirement, like you have in the Medicaid chapter, so states can't cut the benefit levels. Even a bigger concern is weeks. Prior to the Great Recession, I'm not sure there was any state that paid less than 26 weeks of benefits. For decades, everybody paid at least 26 weeks. We have 8 or 9 states now that pay less than 26. Missouri's 13, Florida's now 12, I think. And you could also have a potential for that going down as more federal, at a minimum, a maintenance of effort there too, but I would tie that to a larger issue, harder to enact. The final Obama budgets had a really important proposal to restructure federal and state UI financing. It was a series of federal carrots and sticks designed to move states to adequately fund their UI trust funds. And as part of those carrots and sticks, you could now design it to hopefully get back to a 26-week minimum in all states. But I really do worry, in the absence of that, if we had another recession of the magnitude of the one we had in '09 and so forth, you look at financing of state UI trust funds today, and in a lot of states, they are really not ready, and you could have really big problems that from a counter-cyclical standpoint lead to actions that go in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I think that's an important one that goes under the category of shoring up what we have,
Yes.
Which is an important place to start. Let me add, we have some really great audience questions. We'll be taking some more of those, and I'm actually going to go with an audience question before I get to my questions, because it's something I was actually thinking of last night. So it's a question for Gabe, but anybody can answer it. One of the things that we don't talk about in the book, and that you don't talk about specifically in the UI chapter, is the job sharing idea, which of course in some states allow firms to cut people's work weeks short, and then they can get some UI benefits so that firms are less likely to lay people off. Could you speak for a minute about if you thought about that, or what you think about that proposal? And then I'm curious if anybody else wants to weigh in on that one.
Yeah, so I think there are definitely potential attributes to job sharing. It's a little bit distinct from UI, although it integrates. It integrates in a way which is important, something we do talk a bit about in the chapter and have some proposals, which is how to increase receipt of UI by people who are unemployed. And that's one of the issues that receipt has declined over many decades, and there's sort of 2 issues that go into that. Yeah. One is eligibility, and the other is take-up. And the take-up, the secretary spoke a bit about how to make that easier for individuals to take up. But a lot of the eligibility goes to rules which were formulated decades ago about eligibility when we had single earner households and everybody worked full-time, and you didn't have people working part-time or cycling in and out of the labor force. And these things all affect eligibility, what's called the monetary criterion for eligibility for UI. So I'd put work sharing in that sort of larger bucket of things where we would like to maybe relax a little bit how easy it is to claim and what the restrictions are on that.
I just add that to the degree especially when you have longer and deeper recessions, to the degree that people are out of jobs for long periods of time, especially people on the lower wage, lower skill end of the labor market, there can be scarring effects. Mm-hmm. And to the degree that job sharing can reduce the number of people who are out month after month after month, I think it's a positive, and that it is worth exploring what the federal government could do to encourage more states to do more things that make it easier for employers to use job sharing.
And that wouldn't, I mean, the way we do it now, it does work through the UI system, but one could also imagine other ways to do it. One sort of data point to that, of course, is that during the Great Recession, Germany also saw a very large decrease in their output, just like we did, but didn't see the rise in unemployment. And a lot of people think that that had something to do with their work sharing policies that allowed them to cut hours without, and give people some benefits so that people weren't fully laid off. And the scarring effect is really important there. I want to tap into a theme that I've heard from a number of you, to tap into this, what you just said, Gabe, about eligibility. And Lourdes, you mentioned that Maryland is doing some interesting things here. With the, we all can do so many super cool things on our phones now, right? And have so much access to ways that we could streamline applications and how people are getting onto these programs. So one, on eligibility, but two is take up, right? Are people not taking up because it's too hard to apply for food stamps, or too hard to figure out how to get to the offices, or they're closed? What do you know about what folks are doing out there in the states or federally to expand the take-up through the uses of technology or other mechanisms?
I can speak first to what we're doing in Maryland. In Maryland, we're building a platform that would allow to break down the silos that have historically prevented us from knowing the real story of the families that come to our doors. For example, I know that many states would argue that they have an integrated eligibility system, meaning that when one applies for cash, they can also apply for SNAP benefits and Medicaid. But what Maryland is doing is somewhat unique, because not only we would have an integrated eligibility system like the other states have, but the system would also have access to the data of all the different departments in the state of Maryland. For example, I have child welfare as part of one of my programs. When a family comes in to apply for cash assistance, I would be able to identify if that family has had a history in the child welfare program, or if they have been served by the Department of Juvenile Services, or if they are on Medicaid or disability. And in the future, we would also add education. So what it does, it breaks the silo within the state. So far, we have only been able to break the silos within the departments. This is broader. I want us to think about, I use the analogy of an airport, and I want to use it again. You build an airport. My favorite is BWI because I'm in Maryland, so I'm going to use Maryland. You go to BWI, and that's the airport. That's the platform that we're building, the airport. But that does not mean that Delta Airlines, when they use the platform, they lose their identity. They do not. And same with Spirit Airlines. They fly out of the airport, but they don't lose their identity. So when Department of Human Services joined the platform, they're still Department of Human Services, and the safeguarding of information that we all know we have to. And the same with Department of Health. They would still be Department of Health. So this is as a significant cost savings as well, because what we have had for a number of years is each state, each department building their own system, their own platform. And I can say that also what is unique in Maryland is that we don't have an integrator We're our own integrator. So this is very innovative and different, and I'm really excited. But what it would also do is that it will provide mobility. So now my caseworkers that are out in the field will have an iPad, will have a phone where they can go, and when they make visits to the client, they would have all the information, and they would also be able to process the work. And I'm tired of audit findings where I'm told that the case notes are not in the file. Well, that would no longer be the case, because the case notes will be in the file, because the caseworker will be able to enter the case notes as they're in the house or in the home or when they go back to the car. So that's some of the examples. They will have a consumer portal that they would make application, and they will have information at the tip of their
So I'm going to call on Bob and then Diane, but I love the analogy of every different agency building their own airport. Like that does sound a little chaotic. Bob?
Well, advances in information technology really provide options of using data from one program to almost automatically enroll someone in another program. A number of states, when instituting the Medicaid expansion, adopted a mechanism, we and others worked on this, to do an electronic screen of your SNAP caseload. And about 80% of people, when you ran the screen, it shows they're eligible for Medicaid under the expansion. You have all the information you need. 20% you need additional info. But what's not utilized enough, more states are moving in this direction, is to use this kind of computer integration not only when people apply on the front end, but when they're recertified. So a big issue in means-tested programs is churn. A lot of people cycle off even though they're still eligible. At the 6-month or 12-month redetermination point, they don't get the data in time, they don't understand they had to come back in the office. And the new area of innovation here, I think, is you take one program, it could be Medicaid, it could be SNAP, the person is up for renewal, and you take all the information you get from them and you use it to renew them in the other program, whichever Medicaid or SNAP is first, so you don't have to go through the same thing all over again 60 days later. And in states that are adopting this, the data are there. It shows it significantly reduces churn, and you don't want churn at any point, but you really don't want churn in the middle of a recession.
Yeah, building off that, I would say that SNAP enjoys pretty high take-up rates right now. 85% of eligibles participate. And part of that, we think, is because schools reach out to families, because being on SNAP conveys categorical eligible for free or reduced price lunches. And probably it's also good for the kids to, to have access to both. So probably some in their self-interest and some, sort of for the social good. They're reaching out, and families learn about it that way and other ways.
So what we're hearing about this basket of automatic stabilizers is that there's a lot of, you have to have a lot of administrative capacity to actually make these work. It's a lot more complicated in some ways than just sending checks out to people, because you have to have these institutions up in place. One thing that I wanted to touch on before we leave this topic is administrative capacity. And if anyone wanted to weigh in on what kinds of administrative supports or budget questions are really pressing that we should be thinking about now. Diane, do you want to?
I was going to defer to, to Lourdes.
Thank you. The administrative capacity, I have to build that capacity, right? Right now, the caseloads, one would argue that are high. And in a recession, it would be expected that it would be even higher. So how do you prepare for that additional work? We have to look at automating some of the processes. Historically, local human services agencies, because they're social workers, right? And social workers, they like to see their people. So they like to have the clients coming into their office. And to what Bob said here, we don't need that. We can do so much work online, or they can apply from their phone. And we can also look at the length of reapplication, recertification is very important, where we don't need to see them every 6 months, every 12 months. Now, we will have to put the policies in place to do so, but that is all part of the readiness that we will need to look into it, and also have to think of what regs we need to put into place. And it's good time because we all know that in Maryland, I only have 90 days for my session. So I need to now start thinking of what regs, what bills do I need to propose so I can be prepared and to waive some of the length of benefits renewal times.
Okay.
I know very little about administrative networks and state government, but I do know that an alternative to trying to enroll and verify all these many other criteria in a recession is to relax the criteria in the recession, and that helps you to relieve the administrative burden. I think SNAP has had some of that. You've been able to get waivers for some of the asset requirements if unemployment was high. And maybe that would be another.
Period. Yeah.
Well, period maybe, but in the spirit of talking about things which are countercyclical and automatic stabilizers, that pushes in that direction too.
And that's something folks could start thinking about now. I want to get to a couple of audience questions. One of them that came up is that we've not really, over the course of today, talked about employment gaps by race, by region, urban or rural, or disability, or even really gender. None of those things have really come into the conversation. How can we account for some of these differences? Because we know that some of these differences tend to be especially magnified during recessions within the context of these kinds of automatic stabilizers. Gabe, and then Bob.
I think that's a great question. And this is one where I tried to de-emphasize a little bit what UI can do at a national macro level, given the amount of dollars that are potential. At the local level, it's a really well-targeted program for communities which are experiencing particular long-term unemployment, have had particularly adverse shocks in a recession. So this is part of, I think, not losing sight of the role of these programs as insurance in addition to stimulus, and at a local level they may be much more potent than nationally.
And I'd say basically the same exact thing for SNAP. We know that workers, Hispanic workers, African American workers took longer to recover from the recession, and because of the strong design of SNAP now, they were eligible for longer.
I would argue that this is a really important reason, I'm reinforcing a point I made earlier, to have substantial safety net components in a stimulus package or in automatic stabilizers in advance. If you just do UI and tax cuts, I don't know exactly what the breakout is, but I would imagine that it does not have a disproportionate impact on people of color who, it's still true to some degree, last hired, first fired. When you put additional funding when the economy goes down into targeted safety net programs, you have more of an emphasis on those communities. So I think that it's another element of what we're talking about today.
Well, and I think it's important to emphasize throughout the day and throughout the book, different chapters use different triggers, and some of them are at the federal level, some are at the state level. I mean, so both the UI and SNAP and the TANF proposal as well is targeted to states and places that are experiencing automatically, right? Because if you have more unemployed people, you're getting more UI. You have more low-income people, you're getting more SNAP. And so it is important to recognize that none of these policies are one-size-fits-all, but that you have to kind of think about this range. Is there something you wanted to add to that?
I'm just thinking more about this targeting question, an issue I was wrestling with, particularly after reading the Psalm chapter. The chapter does not suggest that these flat payments to everybody up the income scale are instead of anything else. I would be concerned if, particularly in a longer recession, if there were subsequent rounds of payments, if they were instead of one of the features of the 2009 Recovery Act, which was temporary improvements in the earned income credit and the low income component of the child tax credit. If you only had a given amount of money to put out in taxes, both from a poverty standpoint and from a bang for the buck marginal propensity to consume standpoint, I'd argue you might want like people on the EITC to get somewhat more in dollars than people with 6 or especially 7-figure incomes. So just sort of another element in thinking about how to do a tax component or a flat payment component of a package.
So just to kind of bring it full circle to where we started with Bob Rubin this morning, what are the questions of fiscal consequences of this set of ideas that we've been talking about up here? So how should we be thinking, and it kind of ties into the next question I want to ask, which is, how do we think about the politics of this? How do we make these happen? Should we think about doing this now in different pieces? How is the recession frame a good one? But I want to start with this question about the pay-fors. How should we be thinking about that vis-a-vis these, if we're thinking about them in advance? So I'm kind of like pre-butting the next question by saying if we're thinking about them now, the question is very different than if we're thinking about it in a recession. Gabe?
So I very much believe in long-run budget constraints, and they should be obeyed. I also believe that we should be doing more stimulus during recessions, and I would put automatic stabilizers into the camp of things that we should definitely be doing in recessions, and it would be great if, when we budgeted for them up front, we thought about how to pay for them, but if that was not politically feasible, I would be comfortable saying that these are policies that we ought to have irrespective of that. And you know, relative to some of the other fiscal changes which have been done in the last few years, this is not at that magnitude.
Well, and UI, of course, has the advantage that it is supposed to be a program that pays for itself in advance. That's what the trust funds are all about, through taxes on employers.
Well, the state level,
the state level
part, and that's certainly, so we didn't address that in the chapter, but I fully agree that that's important to shore up. But these federal things on top of that really would be coming out of federal general revenue. And there you have to think about whether you know, it's important that Congress budget for them in advance.
I totally agree with Gabe's answer. There was a comment in an earlier panel that I thought was interesting. I forget who it was, said, if you were doing an automatic stabilizers package, the kinds of things recommended in the book, and you were in a period when you weren't in a recession, it was before a recession, someone said maybe you'd have a better chance of passing it politically if it was paid for over the long term. Mm-hmm. It might be, or it might not be. I don't think it's clear. It might be politically easier to pass it if you weren't paying for it at all, because everybody likes not everybody, many people like the idea, in the abstract, the idea of you should pay for it, until you put the specific pay-fors on the table, and then all the stakeholders for those particular things you're paying for it in head for the exits and oppose the whole package. So I agree, if you could pay for that over time, over the long term, not contemporaneously, it would be a good idea, but I wouldn't want to lose the potential for something to put a lot of the ideas in this book into law before the next recession hits. I wouldn't want to lose it on the grounds that you weren't able to get political support to pay for it.
I think what I want to add to this is, I think something that we have underdeveloped, you know, historically about stabilizers, because we've left it to the macroeconomists, is the real toll that it takes in terms of long-term impacts on people, right? So in this last recession, we saw states increase class sizes to respond to short-term budget constraints. That has a long-term impact on the human capital development. Increasingly, we're understanding the, you know, crucial importance of the earliest years, you know, to the extent that we didn't insulate those young children from shocks. We'll see that, you know, harm them for the rest of their lives. So I think this needs to be a bigger part of the conversation, so that, you know, we can think about what are our budget priorities.
So in the remaining few minutes that we have left, I want to sort of go down and ask each of you the question about what do you think is politically possible? What would be kind of your preferred strategy if you have thoughts on that? And then, as a little bit of a bonus at the end, a couple of people asked, what are things that are not in the book that are maybe like that maybe you have been thinking about? The book's out now, so we can't really add anything. But you can at least say it here, and then people will know what we should have also added. Do you want to go first, Gabe?
Sure.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of agree with what Jason said earlier, that some of the way of framing this might not be about stimulus, but other things. And so David Wessel and I were having a conversation about some of these UI eligibility criteria. And they really are antiquated in the sense that they were developed in a time when you had single earner households. And as work has changed and the work environment has changed, it makes sense to update what those eligibility criteria are. And as a byproduct, you're going to increase the number of people who are eligible and potentially claiming, and that increases the automatic stabilization point part of UI. My favorite proposal not in the book is a expiring debit card for restaurant meals. And the rationale is expiring, so people have to spend it, so high MPC. Restaurant meals are something you don't substitute intertemporally, and so you don't have that aspect. And they're not money that goes to imports from abroad. It's money that most of which is produced domestically.
I love it. Jay, we should have, all right.
Exactly. So I think for me, politically, what we could do best on SNAP is ensure that we don't wreck it in the short run. Trying to head off increased work requirements, things like that is high on my priority list. I think it's possible. What I think is missing that I regret not talking about earlier is this increased money for education when state budgets get crunched and they cut back on that. Short-term cutbacks and things like pre-K programs just do long-term damage. Yeah.
For me, I truly believe that recession is becoming the bad word. So the more we talk about recession, people are going to be reacting. That's not happening, and we need to continue to talk about it. But we need to talk about it in a very strategical way. And my legislation in Maryland is very interested in getting ready for the upcoming recession, and that's something that they have even asked me at budget hearings, and they're very interested in us coming up with what is our strategy in case of a recession, and I believe all states should start thinking of that and making that part of their budget preps. That it would be very important. One thing that we have not talked about it is our employers are, and when I was referring to the data, we have so much data. We can identify the employers that will be impacted adversely if there's a recession. And as a result, we know that if they're impacted adversely, they will be giving their employees laid off, and they would end up applying for benefits and applying for unemployment. So one thing that I think is let's support those employers. Let's identify the employers and give them the support now that they would need. Secondly, if their employees end up being laid off and they come to apply for unemployment, labor should be talking about SNAP benefits to those people, because chances are that they meet the eligibility criteria, and that could be another automatic stabilizer.
I think I'd start by saying that the publication of the book and today's event have to be a beginning of an ongoing conversation. It can't be that people look at the book initially, put it on the shelf, the event is in the past, and people move on to other things. I mean, what I'm saying is we need an ongoing effort on the part of a lot of organizations and individuals to do a major public education campaign. I mean, we need people on Capitol Hill and the media, both parties, to hear the kinds of things Christy Romer was talking about the risks of what could happen in the next recession. given all the things that in the early panels people were talking about. And I think we really need an effort to educate people and build the case for some of the specific proposals. To give one example, when I started to read Claudia's chapter, I mean, my first reaction was, 0.5 percentage point? You mean if the unemployment rate goes from 3.8 to 4.4, that should trigger this stuff? So my first reaction was, this doesn't seem right at all. Then I read the chapter and the no false positives, and I was blown away by it. But most people of both parties, I think, on the Hill will have the same initial reaction I did, and most of them aren't going to read the whole chapter. So we need a mechanism to disseminate the most top-line findings that came out of today and the book. Because right now there is no urgency on this on the Hill. For neither party is it one of their top 20 priorities. And we need to get people to understand we have serious risks here when the next recession hits. And there are things we can do in advance, and there are options. You don't have to take everything in every chapter of the book, but let's get the discussion started. So I think that's a several-year enterprise we all have to engage in.
Well, thank you. I think we are starting a conversation, and this is actually very inspired to hear. When we started this project a little over 1.5 years ago, as Jay said at the beginning, we were at a big conference of macroeconomists, and I was just really struck by some macroeconomist was on the podium. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to need more automatic stabilizers, and then he just went off and kept talking about something else, and we were like, well, but that's a whole thing. That's not just one line. That is a whole conversation about connecting the dots between all of these details about these programs and things that we could actually be doing now to shore them up, that we need to bring into that larger conversation about what's good for our economy and how we're going to address recessions at some point off in the future. So thank you, Bob, for sort of ending on that, because I feel inspired. This is great. So the start of a conversation. We'll be talking, I think, for years to come about the SOM rule. And we'll all be watching for that, I'm sure. So now all the journalists will know like when the recession is coming, because now we have this forecast. It's great. So on that positive note about the worth and value of economics, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. And I encourage you all to pick up the book. And let's thank this panel.